first and only item on the agenda this evening is the Willamette Falls Legacy Project Master Plan, CP 14-01, Zone Change and Text Amendment, ZC 14-03, Comprehensive Map Plan Amendment and amendments to ancillary documents of the Comprehensive Plan, PZ 1401, and the creation of a multimodal mixed-use area, MMA. I have a brief quasi-judicial script for the procedures for this hearing that I will now read related to this group of items that we're going to be looking at tonight. A staff report has been prepared for this item and made available to the public 7 days before the public hearing. The staff report identifies approval criteria that apply to each applicant's proposal. Staff has analyzed the criteria which are contained in the staff report. The quasi-judicial hearing procedure that the Commission will follow is set out in state law and the Oregon City Municipal Code. The hearing procedure steps are shown on the chart on the wall. Anyone wishing to speak should fill out a speaker's card and give it to the planning staff before the hearing. Speakers will proceed in the order in which their cards are received. You should fill out your address on the card so that the city will notify you of its final decision. For the public record, please begin all testimony stating your name. Testimony and evidence should be directed toward the applicable approval criteria. If you believe other criteria apply in addition to those addressed in the staff report, identify and discuss those criteria and explain how and why you believe they apply to the application under consideration. A person may submit any written material while the public record is open on each application. Any written materials received by the city staff during the time period in which the record is open will be placed in the record. Written materials submitted during the public hearing must be presented to the city staff in order to become part of the record. If a person intends for PowerPoint presentations, oversized poster boards, reports, pictures, or other exhibits used in their oral testimony to be placed in the record, copies must be submitted to the city staff while the record is open. If they are not given to staff, they will not be included in the record. Any person wishing a continuance to present additional evidence and testimony or to keep the record open to respond to new evidence must make that request before the public testimony portion of the hearing is closed. If the Planning Commission makes a decision with which you disagree, any issue that you may wish to appeal must have been raised for the consideration of the City Commission or LUBA or both. Without raising the issue on the record with sufficient specificity and accompanied by statements or evidence that the city and all parties can respond, the issue will not be deemed appealable to the State Land Use Board of Appeals. In addition, the failure of an applicant to raise constitutional or other issues related to proposed conditions of approval with sufficient specificity to allow the local government or designee to respond to the issue precludes any action for damages in circuit court. We will now open the record for the Willamette Legacy Project and the files that I've just read. Does any commissioner have any ex parte contacts, conflicts of interest, bias, or any other statements to declare? And has any commissioner, since the last meeting, visited the site?
Nope. None.
Nope.
None for me.
I have none.
None.
I do have one communication to declare. I had a brief conversation with a co-worker in my office. We're an architectural firm, and he's another architect in the firm who worked at Metro and has had some involvement in the historic building inventory at the Blue Heron site. He expressed that he was excited to see the Legacy project move forward because there is so much potential for this very historic place. I expressed that I was in agreement with his sentiments. My boss, who is nearby, joined in the conversation and expressed similar opinions about the unique nature of the site. We did not have any discussion about the process beyond that. And the name of the two individuals that were involved in the conversation was Robert Lieb and Tim Richard. Does the audience have any questions about the declarations that have been made? Seeing none, we will proceed. And I've been directed that we will start with public testimony and then have the staff and application presentations after. So I will proceed in the order that the cards have been submitted to me. Caroletta Colette.
Carlotta.
Carlotta
Okay.
Colette. Do I have to do anything to have this on? Great, thank you.
Just introduce yourself.
Hi, good evening. I'm Carlotta Collette. I'm a Metro Councilor. I serve District 2, which includes Oregon City. And I am so excited to be here tonight before all of you planning commissioners, because I think we are at a historic moment in this city and in this region, and frankly in the whole state. And a lot of that depends on your decisions coming up. I think your city has done an incredible job of managing the vision plan that developed into the comprehensive plan changes, the zoning change, the information that you have before you, all of the information that you're considering. I speak here today on behalf of the Metro Council. Officially, this is my comments from the Metro Council, but honestly, I think I'm speaking for the rest of the region. I think we all agree that this is the most exciting thing to come along for this region and probably this whole state in a very, very long time. I update people around the region regularly. I speak before the West Side Economic Alliance, the Clackamas County Business Alliance, East Multnomah County Chambers, East Portland Chambers. I update them all, the Labor Council, on this project. And they call me back over and over again because they want to see what's happening, what's going on, is it happening yet, when can we see changes? They've all toured the site. They all agree that this is an incredible direction that we're all excited about. I think your staff has hit exactly the right point on the comprehensive plan changes and the multimodal zoning, the mixed-use multimodal zoning, because really, this is a site that is so complex. There's so many buildings. There's so much magnificence in the natural setting, as well as really in some of the architecture. And the way that this has been designed is that it allows some real protection, a real care given to protecting those resources, but also enough flexibility so that a really creative developer and their partners and all of us as partners can go in there and do some spectacular things. So I think you have an opportunity here to move this project forward. I'm grateful that we have a private partner who sees this as his personal legacy. It's not just Willamette Falls Legacy Project, but he views this as a personal legacy. He wants to do something world class. He uses that language all the time. So, you know, person's only as good as their word and what they do, and all of us will keep watch and keep making sure that he lives up to his promises. But truly, we have a great partner here, and Metro is honored, very honored, to be your partner, the Oregon City's partner, Clackamas County's partner, the state's partner on this project. We hope you all move forward, and I think you've just done an incredibly good job looking at an incredibly complex site and coming out with a really masterful change of your code and your zoning. So thank you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Got one.
Yes.
Thanks for showing up tonight.
My pleasure. I love Oregon City.
You make us look good.
You are good.
That's a matter of opinion. I understand that Metro is negotiating with the property owner the access points, the size of the access, public access, what have you. Can you comment on that as to the nature of the negotiations and how they're proceeding and what have you?
Well, not a whole lot, frankly, because we are awaiting your decisions. We can't finalize any easement agreement until the zoning changes have taken effect. So, but we are negotiating for an easement to provide a substantial portion of the property that will be public access. When we talk to the public and we ask them what's important to you, pretty much everybody got to the falls and said public access. So that's the first thing Metro wants to do with our partners, is develop what we're calling a river walk. Big, easy enough for people to just get down to the falls and really experience that whole site. So we are in easement negotiations. We are also negotiating with PGE to get easement across the dam, to get out to what we call the dance floor, which is really the site that we need to secure for people being able to feel the mist on their faces.
If this site were, and that being the easement, is in a sense non-buildable because it's going to be an open walkway area, is there any concern given to that it might be dedicated to the public? Somebody's going to have to maintain it. And if it's an easement, then the implication is that the property owner, in some way, shape, or form, unless it was written into the easement, would be responsible for maintaining it. But what about the dedication of the open space to the public in perpetuity?
Well, it'll depend on the terms of the easement. Generally, when Metro secures an easement, we secure it in perpetuity.
Good.
So we would have access. We are still talking with Oregon City and the state and others about who would actually own and maintain the river walk. So that's still, again, because we haven't really finalized any of the decisions you're making, let alone the easement agreement. But that would be the next step in negotiations after we have an easement. After we get it built, will be who's going to own and operate it. But my sense is it will be a partnership again, because it will be so valuable to the whole community. And the fact that it is an easement for public access does not mean that nothing can be built in it. Something could probably be built. I mean, small things, obviously, or you might have food kiosks or something like that around it. So it's not just a sidewalk. It could be a pretty lively, exciting place.
Okay.
Other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The next person signed to speak is Catherine Comer.
Hello, good evening. My name is Catherine Comer. I'm Manager of Business and Economic Development for Clackamas County. I've had the privilege for the last couple of years to serve on the project management team for this project. Clackamas County became involved in this project in 2011 when Blue Heron closed. Our Board of County Commissioners have indicated through many meetings and considerations with this plan throughout the last couple of years the need for a replacement of the lost jobs when Blue Heron closed. And they have been focused on economic redevelopment of this site. They have supported financially the efforts for this plan. We think it's a good plan. We think that this plan brings forth the opportunity for private investment and is flexible to allow private investment. We support the Riverwalk as a catalyst for private investment, and the Board of County Commissioners have continued to support financially, as well as serving on the partners group, the continuation of seeking additional funds for this site. So again, we support this and continue to support it. The staff of Oregon City have done an incredible job leading this project, leading the project management team, and I echo a lot of what Councilor Collette said about the opportunities for this site and the opportunities for the region. I have as well had opportunities to bring many visitors from out of the state and provide tours of this site, and the excitement and the possibilities that this offers to Oregon City and to the region, I think, is just the tip of the iceberg of what this could really be when fully developed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next person to speak is Michael Williams.
Commissioners, thank you for having me here. My name is Michael Williams. I'm a business development officer for Business Oregon, which is a state agency. I'm also a representative of the Governor's Regional Solutions team, which has been tracking this project for some time. Our view of this project is that it's really a result of a broad public engagement process that we think was synthesized very well by really what is a world-class technical team. And I think it's really important that the project took place this way, because this project is going to need to reflect the values of Oregon City, but there is also a lot of development barriers that are on this site in regards to the market and in regards to infrastructure. In regards to the history of the site. And we think that that this plan has done a really good job of getting those aspects right, as well as the technical aspects that are needed for development. We also believe that this development has tremendous upside, not only for the Oregon City, but for the region and the state as a whole. It could be, and most likely will be, a really special place. And knowing this, the state has made a commitment to invest up to $5 million into helping get secure public access to the site. Now, this $5 million has a couple strings attached, and there's a financing plan and a public access that needs to be secured as well. And I do think that the passing of the master plan and zone amendment will help this process along. And I think that that this plan also does a good job in presenting a vision to the market as well. And a site like this, I think, needs some vision, and I think that this is it's a good vision, and it's one that will be very useful in trying to attract development in the site. So I am with Business Oregon, and we are focused on jobs and job potential, and I do think that there is quite a bit of that, and I think all that job potential also can cohabitate or exist side by side all the other historic, recreational, and commercial benefits that this site will bring to the community in the region. Thank you.
You say you're a state agency?
Yeah, Business Oregon. We're the State Economic Development
Oh,
Agency.
okay.
Yeah, just a new name.
All right.
Another new name.
Yep, so I'm told.
Any other questions?
Well, I guess I wanted to just specify, jobs is pretty broad, and
Yeah.
is the state looking at helping us maintain, and continue with family wage jobs? Because, let's face it, the minimum wage is $9.10 an hour, and you can't do a whole lot with that if you're
Yeah.
trying to support
Yeah.
yourself. So family wage jobs would be obviously much more appropriate.
Right. Well, I think that the state is showed its commitment to starting, in terms of its investment, is starting with the public access to the site, and I think that that's a very deliberate strategy that will help bring other types of development to the site. And when the time comes, we will be there to help recruit and help incentivize businesses to come to the site, traded sector businesses, because that, for the most part, that's at least Business Oregon's.
Right.
That's the Department of Business Oregon is what we do. Now, Regional Solutions Team, the Governor's Regional Solutions Team, has members from many different agencies, including Parks, which is also providing their technical expertise as well. So, so the jobs isn't the only value, but it's the value that Business Oregon will be engaged on.
You might not be able to answer this question. It may be impertinent, but I'm going to ask it anyway. This property was picked up at a significantly reduced price, other than what the state has contributed. You're contributing $5 million. Why didn't the state just buy the property itself? I mean, tourism alone is just going to offer so many jobs that it just knock your hat off.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty complicated question. I guess it's just a matter of I don't think that the state has been involved in buying and redeveloping multi-purpose, multi-use
Well, I'm not
locations.
asking
But I
the
do
state
think
to do that.
I do think it's probably has been debated. I mean, the site has a lot of I think a lot of different developers and interests looked at the site, and they either passed or wanted conditions due to the many development risks that were on the site. So it's really hard to say. It's a complicated undertaking, to say the least. But that's why we think that's why we support this master plan so much. It's because I think that this master plan will really help guide that complicated undertaking. And I think a lot of the complication of this site has been taken away by the master plan and by all the, like I said, by the combination of the public input and the technical expertise, which is substantial. That wasn't a cheap report, and those were good consultants that were used.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Private sector jobs are very good jobs.
The next person to speak is James Nikita.
Nasita.
Nasita?
Nasita.
Need somebody else to read these things.
Okay, so I have one of these for the record.
The Exhibit A for tonight.
Exhibit A or Exhibit 8?
A.
A.
As an apple.
A is an apple.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm James Nasita. I live here in Oregon City. And although we're talking about Blue Heron tonight in the draft framework master plan, I'd like to start out by talking about libraries and librarians. In particular, I'd like to call out Sue Adams, who's here with us tonight. She's the librarian at the Oregon City Public Library, who got the grant for the library to digitize all of Oregon City's historic newspapers.
Nice.
And for a history junkie like me, who lives right above the mill on the McLaughlin Promenade, being able to satisfy my curiosity of the Blue Heron Mill, that database is an enormously useful tool, and it helped me inspired me to write a series of articles in the Oregon City News, of which a lot of that research I've compiled for you in this booklet, with the footnotes that don't get published in the newspaper. What I wanted to chat about tonight is the historic preservation aspect of the Blue Heron Mill redevelopment. I couldn't, they say truth is stranger than fiction, and I have found the history of this mill site going back to McLaughlin and moving up through the pioneering early industrial phase to just be really, really fascinating. And some of the structures that are on the site, I think, strongly merit preservation. The plan calls out for 5 buildings and sites to be preserved. I'd like to offer this as kind of like inventory supplement information to make the case that all of the buildings that were called out in 2012 by the SHPO, by the State Historic Preservation Officer, except probably the water filtration plant, which none of the research I've done really says is really historic, merit some kind of protection under the Framework Master Plan. This book is basically kind of a profile of all those buildings that the SHPO listed out. I found newspaper articles on most of them, not all of them. And then I have an appendix of background information that was published in the Oregon City News series and stuff I actually haven't published yet. A lot of it's just raw newspaper articles from the 1860s and 70s about some of these structures like woolen mills in the basin, etc. So I'd like to supplement the inventory information in the record with that. My understanding of the Framework Master Plan is that there are kind of 2 tiers. One is the first tier, which are the ones up there that not only are important but are developable as well. And then there are some second tier which have more challenges. A couple of buildings, I think, by that standard, are both really significant and in really good shape. One being the Mildy Warehouse first unit on 4th and Water Street that was built in 1913.
That's 3 minutes.
Okay. And the second is the Woolen Mills Pullery building, which is spectacular, and the oldest building on the site. I think all the rest merit at least second-tier status in the Framework Master Plan, again, except for the water filtration plant. With that, there's a lot of information here. If you want to set up a session to go through this in detail, I'd urge you to use it as like a tour book, to take a tour of the site with it. I'm here, in future sessions to answer detailed questions on the historical research. But I agree with everything that everybody else has said. This is a fantastic opportunity, and our historic preservation legacy is just, out of the park, significant and wonderful, and we should cherish that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, one thing you mentioned, Chair, about criteria, and I just in my notes with the record, I want to call out the Goal 5 rule. Typically, when you do a zone change and plan amendment, you have to apply the statewide planning goals. And there's a Goal 5 rule, implementing rule at OAR 660-023-0200, which I think applies to this proceeding. Thanks.
Jim, just a quick comment. Just wanted to congratulate you on this. I've been following this in the paper. It's incredible history to follow all this and read all this and have someone compile it all together. I look forward to reading this some late night. But a great job on putting this together.
Okay. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Jim, before you go, you want to repeat the citation one more time?
Oh, yeah. That is OAR 660-023-0200. It's in the Goal 5 implementing rule. Thank you.
And thank you to our wonderful librarian, too.
Yeah.
Well done.
This is great to read.
Yeah, it's amazing. And if I mispronounce your name, it's because
Want me to look?
I'm an architect. Language is not my master. Elaine Dorset.
Yep, you did that right.
Good evening. My name is Elaine Dorset. I live in Milwaukee, but I'm actually here representing the Board of Directors of the Oregon Archaeological Society. And we'd like to state that we agree with and appreciate the city and the owner's efforts towards the goal of historic interpretation. This is, as we all know, a highly significant site. However, a review of the management plan shows that it primarily deals with the built environment. And we understand that this is private property and not subject to code, by code to certain cultural resources protections. But we're advocating for careful assessment and circumspect actions towards the likely presence of archaeological resources that are eligible for the National Register. It's unknown at this point what soils and/or sediments are present at the site. Certainly where basalt is exposed, it is unlikely that there are sedimentary archaeological deposits. However, the staff report indicates that nearly 50% of the site is out of the flood zone, is currently covered by concrete and asphalt. So it's possible that sediments, both native soils and fill, are present in those areas. Buried native soils would likely manifest as the prehistoric to mid-19th century living surface, with possibly prehistoric and likely mid-19th century artifacts and features contained below the buried surface. Also, historical photos indicate that fill was brought in as early as 1865. While fill is generally not considered to have the integrity that intact deposits do, because it's implied to be from somewhere else, fill from this early date is highly likely to contain artifacts and may contain features such as building foundations that will allow for designation of these deposits as eligible for the National Register. We support the condition that for archaeological monitoring, if any archaeological deposits are suspected to be present, rather than the previous designation that only if native soils are suspected. It is our strong suggestion that an archaeological testing project be conducted on the overall site previous to any ground disturbing demolition or development. This will provide a greater understanding of site formation processes and direction for the owner and developer when formulating plans. For example, the testing may show that there are areas of the site that have already been cleared in the past of significant deposits. Allowing those areas to move ahead to be developed with archaeological monitoring, while other areas may require additional archaeological work or need to be avoided altogether. Knowing these site conditions while development planning is in its beginning stages would lead to informed decisions and less likelihood of time-consuming and costly changes in plans during development and when significant archaeological deposits are discovered. We'd also like to suggest the possibility that this archaeological testing project can be an opportunity for public outreach and education, and if planned as such, there may be partial funding available through educational and preservation grants. The OAS also would be pleased to assist with archaeological projects at the site, whether it is providing volunteers for networking, research, or excavation. The OAS is a nonprofit organization with membership consisting of many professional archaeologists and highly trained avocational archaeologists, while the majority of the membership are qualified to excavate with supervision. And if you'd like to contact the OAS, you can email us through our website. So, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say there are petroglyphs down on the
Yes,
waterfront,
absolutely.
and so we definitely want to do what we can to preserve those. It'd
Those
be nice
are a
to view them,
recorded
but not
archaeological
to
site.
get too close to them, because a lot of I've been to sites down in Arizona and such where people just from touching them, just they wear them away, and that's just not what we need. Granted, it's basalt; it's a lot harder than the sandstone down there, but still.
Elaine, are you familiar at all with the work that Jim Hendrickson's been doing all over the country with regard to photographing and bringing to light petroglyphs and other markings of that sort? He lives here in Oregon City.
I'm not familiar with him specifically, but we actually have some members in the society that are very involved with rock art documentation.
Yeah,
But
he's got a process by which, if they look faded to the naked eye, he has his filming process brings those out. I've seen a couple of his slideshows.
yeah, I'm sure it's very impressive. So.
And he's been able to work with local governments and the tribes to make sure that those things are documented and preserved.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you. The next person to speak is Janine Offit.
Hello, I'm Janine Offit. I live here in the McLaughlin neighborhood, and I've been following the visioning and the planning process all along, and I'm really impressed with what I see, and I'd like to thank everybody involved for their tremendous efforts. But my deepest concerns are that the plan leaves the door open to development in part of the floodplain. And I think if we're truly serious about flood management and protection, we'll avoid building in the floodplain and recreate natural habitat there. Because you know, we can count on the Willamette flooding again. It might be one of those springs where there's heavy rains and rapid snow melt, and rivers surging with the overflow of a dozen tributaries. It'll happen again. The Falls area has experienced severe flooding 7 times since 1861. We mapped out the extent of the 1996 flood, and we call it the 100-year floodplain, but nature can be pretty unruly and can ignore the lines that we have on our maps. And in this day and age, climate change seems to be throwing more frequent and intense weather events our way. Record-breaking superstorms are being fueled by more moisture in a warmer atmosphere. For instance, just last month, Long Island got over 13 inches of rain in 24 hours, which is unprecedented in all of New York State history. Nearly 10 inches fell in 2 hours. In mid-May, Bosnia got 3 months of rain in 3 days, creating the worst flood since records began 120 years ago. A third of the country resembled a huge muddy lake with houses and roads and rail lines submerged. At the end of April, 15.5 inches of rain fell in Pensacola in a single day, the largest amount of rainfall since tracking began in 1880. I say give the river wide berth, plan for supersized flooding. I bet Boulder, Colorado wishes they had. In September last year, 21 inches of rain fell on Boulder in a week, leading to what experts called a 1,000-year flood. The city's website chronicles the recovery and reconstruction. The site has helpful FEMA publications that pertain to building in or near floodplain. Hopefully the publications such as Build with Flood Damage Resistant Materials and protecting building utilities from flood damage are already familiar to the planning teams here. We could probably learn a lot from the city of Calgary as well. In June 2013, flooding resulted from 36 hours of constant heavy rain and far exceeded any flood on record in the province. The resulting damage was exacerbated the degree of floodplain development. By far the most expensive natural disaster in 2013 was river flooding that hit Germany and neighboring countries in May and June, causing more than $16 billion in damage. And that's only some of the record flooding that's happened under the past 2 years. The May UN report on climate change urges us all to adapt to the new reality we find ourselves in. They suggest that adaptation is best done on a local level. Here's our challenge. I'd say let's respect the power of nature and not put lives and property at risk by keeping our development out of the floodplain. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next person signed up to speak is Jonathan Stone.
Good evening. My name is Jonathan Stone. I am the Executive Director of Main Street, Oregon City, as well as a resident of Oregon City. So, it's without saying, I think downtown is thrilled with the project and the degree of public involvement and the excitement that is created for Oregon City and downtown Oregon City. We believe that we have a downtown that is about to pop. Even if the mill site doesn't go forward, it is really something tangible and palpable that's happening downtown in terms of a return to a thriving business district. We recently completed a project, a competitive brand analysis, where we identified that the small town feel is the key differentiator of Oregon City, and we see the mill site as symbiotic with the rest of downtown. And since the last last week, there was changes made in Guideline 3 that seem to address the relationship with the rest of the district. So if our competitive advantage is a small town feel, but yet we have this site that we want to be really important and credible, we just need to make sure that they work together. So we count the new property owners among our stakeholders, and the mill office building is part of downtown's economic improvement district. We believe that the master plan captures the public input and provides an important framework for extending downtown in which it's not creating a world unto its own. The letter of public comment that we wrote addressed some of those concerns, which was primarily around, was in support of this idea that the mill brings much needed development space to downtown and primarily addresses issues of housing and contiguous office space. Try finding a 10,000 square foot office available space in Oregon City. You can't do it. And we also believe that the mill site is incredibly important to tourism development in Oregon City. In that letter of public comment, we also mentioned that downtown is just getting back on its feet after the bridge closure and the reconfiguration of Main Street, and that downtown businesses, the ones that are here for the past 1, 2, 3 years, need to succeed in spite of future development at the site. That 5 years, 10 years down the road, when the site comes online, those businesses will be here or won't be here, depending on the success of what we have in the interim. So anything that the Planning Commission to do or the City Commission can do to mitigate the interim and long-term impacts of site development, which we are very much looking forward to, is something that we would like to and help advance that conversation. I believe the plan does address it fairly well, but every opportunity to review and continue to review those things are very important. We look forward to the continued development of this project and working with the partners and the owners and to be downtown's liaison. So, sorry, that was not the most put together set of comments, but it was a bunch of random things that I needed to say. So,
You just talk too fast. I can't write that fast.
she's got the. I can.
It'll be entered in the record tonight.
Very good. Any questions?
I've got one. Jonathan, in your experience, how many estimated tourists do you anticipate if this thing goes through with the Riverwalk? Just a ballpark figure.
I'm not a tourism professional, but if you look at downtown this past weekend, that gives you an idea of what several thousand people looked like in downtown at one time. So something to consider when you have a lot of people in one place at one time.
Well, that's why I asked the question, because if this thing takes off like we hope it will, can downtown remain downtown? The scale of the thing is something that's that just might overrun downtown and no longer a small, quaint downtown. You see what I'm getting at?
I think as long as you don't rezone everything to be 100 feet tall, I think we should be pretty scale appropriate, but something to certainly consider as a planning commission, that you don't want a downtown that's all 10-story buildings through the entire place.
No, we agree. We agree.
I just had an occasion to walk downtown Main Street in Seaside. I was flabbergasted how that has changed. It's big time commercial, big time. And it's just taken away the downtown, small scale downtown away from Seaside. Now it's
I understand there's a balance between what's needed to make development happen, as well as but that the planning commission has a certain role in sort of balancing those things. So
please balance.
Just as a side comment, I was just down Seaside for their car show, emceeing it, and amazingly, they only had one store available that I could have taken, but it was on the second floor. There was only one building on Main Street that had a second floor, and they kept saying nobody would want to open a retail shop there because nobody wants to go up the steps to go to a retail store. But I'm not sure where you were looking, unless it's right on Highway 101. But
I was looking at all the
that's
hotels.
Broadway, and
Canyon.
Yeah, Broadway has got, they're all little private owners because I talked to each one of them.
Let's talk about maybe the prom when you get to
the
the
promenade
end,
at the end,
there's
the
that
big
huge-
hotels and all that.
huge,
Yeah, that was just an
developed
interesting
hotel.
thought. That's why I chose Oregon City rather than Seaside.
Thank you. The last person I have signed to speak is Peggy Sigler.
Good evening. I am Peggy Sigler. I am the Oregon Field Officer for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and I am also a rural Clackamas County resident, so I've watched this process for many years. I want to thank the Commission and the plan and the vision process for recognizing the historic significance of this site. Understanding that the property owner has control of many of the decisions in that final outcome, I do hope that the plan provides a framework for some of the historic preservation items that have already been mentioned. I know that Commissioner McGriff suggested or recommended an intensive level survey, and we definitely concur with that. We think it's important that the intensive level, the recognizance level survey, which has been done now, is actually done on an intensive basis, so that you have a better idea of what exists in the buildings that are there. And I think that Mr. Nacita's study will definitely help add to that. We also urge archaeological assessment and monitoring, which has already been addressed tonight. We urge National Register listing of all eligible properties. That will also provide assessing historic tax credits and other financial opportunities that might not be available. And in the outcome, an authentic restoration and interpretation to Secretary of Interior standards. This, as has been said by your own commission, this is too important of a place to let go, and once it's gone, and there's just too much value there to not take advantage of that right now. You have the decision-making capacity to do that, and we appreciate that you're working in the right direction. So, any questions?
Thank you for reinforcing what we talked about already.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in the public that would like to speak at this time? Okay, seeing none, we will proceed then with the staff presentation.
Thank you, Chair Kidwell. In your packet, you'll see the revised agenda that was sent out on Friday, and that has the matrix of comments as well as some additional exhibits. What we really saw, kind of some of the three main issues we saw bubbling up were related to historic resources, parking, and kind of that understanding of stepping down development towards the river. And right now I'd like to invite up Matt Brown and George Kramer, and they will be speaking on two of those three issues.
Sorry you had to come up here with all this smoke.
There was smoke at home, too.
Yeah.
My name is Matt Brown. I am the president of LOCI as part of the consultant team on this project. My main role on the project essentially was to, I guess you'd say, provide a developer's eye to the planning work that was being done. I'm involved in real estate development here in Portland. Have worked in both public and private sectors, so I think I also have a good sense for how these things play out on kind of both sides of the ledger. I was actually initially interested in the site from a due diligence standpoint because I thought it was what a great opportunity. And as I got into the site and went through a lot of the project documents, began to understand that it was a very, very complicated site, be very difficult to pull off without a lot of, say, initial barriers being removed from the site. So I decided to withdraw, but then the opportunity came up to essentially assist and consult in another capacity. And it's a very fascinating site, which is what attracted to me to continue to be involved in it. I think if we look at kind of the initial analysis that we had on here, there's no doubt that there are some great positives to the site, right? It's a spectacular setting, very rich history, both not just for industrial history here in the kind of the settlement phase, but also with the Native American history going back many thousands of years. There's, I think, ongoing improvement in downtown Oregon City, which is, I think, a sign of kind of a burgeoning and improving area around the downtown. And I also think that one other very important positive that can't be overlooked is there's a strong political commitment at all levels, you know, from local to regional to state here, to see something very positive happen. And I think those are all great things that are going for the site. But we also know that there's some challenges that we've been able to identify right from the beginning. These are no surprises to anyone. I think the site conditions are obviously very difficult to manage. You have a site that's developed over many different years on many different levels by many different engineers. So that makes it hard to kind of pull back apart and to use. There's obviously, when we start, a lack of adequate zoning, lack of infrastructure, the kind of all those things that you look at of what am I going to have to do to make this site work. All of those things were lacking at the outset. And local market conditions are challenging, right, for a site of this type and for the development of this type. So in terms of overcoming those challenges, I think the master plan, these ongoing discussions have been very important, right, in beginning to remove some of those barriers and to provide, I guess, a clearer picture of how this site can come about from a economic development place. So I want to touch a little bit on the market conditions and kind of the report that we did early on and kind of where that led during the process. I believe you were provided that this week as part of your record. I worked with Echo Northwest on that to establish kind of a baseline market analysis for the site. And I mean, just to summarize the entire report in one sentence, right? There is a gap between where the market currently is and where you need to be in terms of covering development costs on this site, right? So to use as an example, if you were just to look at a market rate apartment project in Oregon City, right now rents range from 90 cents to $1.45 per square foot. For development of the type that we're talking about, you need to be somewhere between $2 and $2.20 a square foot, right? For a podium style development, a little bit larger scale, something like that. So this gap, right, has to be closed in some way for the development to be viable. So I'm not going to be doom and gloom here tonight because there are ways. We identified strategies, right, of how to begin to close that gap. So our vision document, I think, especially contains a number of those strategies. So for instance, creating the appropriate land use framework and entitlements for the site, or identifying public investment opportunities for infrastructure, the streets, the utilities, the other elements that are going to be necessary to support new development at the site, the traffic issues that we resolved with ODOT over the course of the process. Very important. So a developer knows when I go in to develop this site, I'm not going to be asked to do off-site improvements, a mile away to take care of what I'm trying to do here on the site. Actually, I was listening, just this quick side note, I was listening to some of your commentary last week and talking about, as part of the infrastructure, how to get pedestrians to and from the site, for instance. And, I know there's a suggestion of a pedestrian overcrossing, for instance, and I just wanted to share a little bit of experience from my work in Baltimore, where we were working with a firm that did a lot of the initial planning for the Inner Harbor site there. And there's actually an at-grade crossing and an overhead crossing at the same location. Over across the street that essentially carries 3 times the traffic of 99E here. It's the main entrance in and out of Baltimore. And if you look at that, there's probably, for every person crossing the bridge, there's 30 or 40 crossing, at grade. That's their desired path. So our experience is seeing that these grade separated crossings work when you can take advantage of existing topography, when there's a reason that doesn't force people kind of out of direction up and over. But if they're given an option, a safe option, secure option to cross at grade, those tend to be highly preferred. They provide a much stronger and better connection for pedestrians. So just a quick aside, but that was interesting that just kind of catching that discussion last week. So even with these strategies, taking care of the entitlements, taking care of the infrastructure, there's still a gap that remains. Part of the strategy was then to begin to talk about how we transform the site. Investing in the Riverwalk, beginning to transform the public perception and the market perception of what this site is, taking advantage of its spectacular setting here at the falls and on the Willamette River. So regardless of the history, regardless of how spectacular the site is, regardless of all our feelings about what it's going to be, it's still going to be a very difficult road. And there's still a lot of risk, I think, for the developer that's coming into this project. So we've been tried to be very specific in terms of our thinking about what the master plan then should entail and how it should allow, I think, for the developer to respond to probably an array of opportunities that may come about in the future. So this is not, for instance, a specific development proposal or a specific development project at this level. We're trying to clear the path in terms of identifying where do the streets go, where is the infrastructure needed, what kind of space needs to be set aside for the Riverwalk, and in general, what kind of size, scale, form, types of uses would be allowed to be accommodated on the site, and what kind of historic resources are we trying to save here and say are the most important elements that need to be saved. So I want to highlight 3 of these areas, I think, in particular that are part of the discussion here and kind of talk about, from a developer's perspective, why we proposed things the way that we did. Certainly on the historic resources piece is absolutely important in terms of creating a sense of place, a unique sense of place at this project, that we incorporate the historic fabric and character of this site. So otherwise you're just left with a blank piece on a nice setting, right? So I mean, there's got to be something that ties back and creates that unique sense of place on the site. We think a lot of those historic resources can be a very important part of that. But at the same time, we've been left with a lot of structures that have no immediate obvious use. At the end of the day, we're dealing with a lot of buildings that were essentially houses for machines. They're not general purpose industrial buildings like you'd see in the Pearl District with these old warehouses, so you could just easily go in and kind of chop up, and all of a sudden you have loft apartments or offices.
Not easily, though.
What's that?
Not easily.
Not easily, but still, at least they had floors. It's a challenge, right? But they're still important that we identify and maintain those. So, I know George can talk a little bit more about the details of that, and you certainly have some proposals together. But I think it is important that we allow the developer some flexibility in determining, what kinds of buildings need to be saved and how. And if they're really important resources, then there are more stringent standards associated with those decisions that have to be made around those projects. Second, I know building heights and kind of how those are used on the site. So we recommended an 80-foot height limit. I think in general that is less than the tallest buildings on the site right now, and it's more or less corresponds to kind of the height of the bluff. I mean, the bluff varies, but trying to kind of maintain a scale there, I think that makes sense. In general, 80 foot will allow you to accommodate what we call a 5/1 type of development, 5 stories of wood over 1 story of concrete. If I had my full developer, hat on, I would say 90 feet might be right, because I could then develop a type 1, a concrete type structure, get it all the way up to 75 foot on the top floor and not hit high-rise standards. So I'm able to take full advantage, right, of the development costs that I'm putting in to a building of that size. But I think 80 foot still works. But I think it's important not to try to be too prescriptive in terms of how that's applied on the site. The approach we've taken is to allow 80 foot anywhere, but to also put together some design guidelines, some development standards that will essentially force the sculpting of that, so that you don't end up with, let's call it like a canyon effect or just a wall of 80 foot buildings. So, to the extent that we want to look at those things, I suggest we look at the design guidelines and the development standards as a way to help guide, the form of the development that we want on the site, but to give the developer the flexibility to move around the uses and the sizes of the uses that he needs to on the site. And then last, obviously, traffic and parking is a big issue, I know. And I'm going to suggest that there are essentially 2 parking issues on the site. One is parking that is needed to serve development, and the other is parking that's needed to serve some number of visitors that we can't quite get our arms around yet, like how many of those might be or where they might be coming from. So on the development side, I think it's very, very important that you use the same standards that you use in downtown Oregon City. So, and at the end of the day, what we're talking about here is structured parking on the site. So if my cost to develop a surface parking lot per space is $9,000 to $12,000 per car, it's $25,000 to $30,000 in an above grade structure, and $40,000 to $50,000 if I'm below grade. Right, so the costs increase tremendously once I go to a structure. That means that as a developer, I'm going to try to get away with the least amount of parking I can that still meets what market says I need to provide on there. So, if market says that the least amount that I'm going to get here to serve office development is 3 per 1,000, then I'm not going to go below that, even if code allows me to. But I don't. There's no reason for me to build to 4 per 1,000, right? If market says I don't need to, especially when I'm dealing with those kinds of costs. On the visitor parking side, I think we have an opportunity with the planning and design for the Riverwalk, for instance, to incorporate into part of that some thinking about, well, what is it really going to take? What do we think visitation is going to be to this area? And how might we accommodate future visitor parking to the site? I think traffic, again, has been taken care of pretty well in this plan, working with ODOT, identifying what the kinds of improvements are that are needed to help provide access to the site, safety improvements along 99E. So I think those issues are pretty well addressed and taken care of as part of the master plan. So I just want to hit on those 3 points, which I know were parts of your discussion last week, and provide you a little bit of context, maybe from a developer's perspective, of how we approach those.
Thank you.
Got a question. Hello, I'm George Kramer & Company out of Ashland. It's a pleasure to be here tonight and see the next step in this resource, this amazingly complex resource. As I've sat and listened to some of the testimony and read through the minutes, I'm struck. I feel old, frankly. I've been working on the Blue Heron site for almost 20 years. My experience with this site stems from Portland General Electric's interest in planning for their Federal Energy Regulatory Commission relicensing. And I can clearly remember starting that in like 1996 and walking across the Oregon City Bridge and looking down at what would eventually become the Willamette Falls industrial area documentation and thinking, what have I gotten myself into? This is just this mess of stuff. And trying to make sense out of that mess of stuff has taken the last 20 years. And so I thought it would be informative for you. A lot of discussion has happened about historic resources in particular, and what's eligible and what isn't eligible, and how we made the decisions. And since I was party to almost all of those decisions in terms of an evaluation process, I thought I should tell you how we did it and why I think it's valid. The determination of eligibility that was released in 2003, which was prepared for Portland General Electric, essentially was a standard compliance level document. It would be a reconnaissance level survey where we identified buildings that were related to the industrial uses on the site as being significant by their date of construction. Although I had access and cooperation from Westland Paper in particular, and Blue Heron to some extent, we didn't really go into many of the buildings. It was simply a date evaluation. But in the course of that project, it struck me how very different these buildings are from the standard structures that we evaluate using normal preservation methods. And that was crystallized when the president of the Blue Heron Paper Company, the plant manager, was telling me that Paper Machine 4 was built in the 60s. And, you know, I have 30 years in this business. I can look at a building and tell when it was built. And I knew that that building wasn't built in the 60s, but he was adamant about it. And in the course of that conversation, it became apparent that Paper Machine 4, to him, was the machine. The building was non-consequential. It was the structure that kept the rain off of it. And they rebuilt the machine, he's right, in the 1960s. And so Paper Machine 4 was 1960s. It's not historic. Why are you saying it is? And so that level of evaluation is where the district eligibility comes from. It was determined eligible, all of it, more because of what it did and what it represented in the industrial history of Oregon from the dam all the way up to the end of the locks, than really much of the architecture or construction or what we would call Criterion C concerns for the National Register. Now, when I came back into this project as part of the site stabilization and analysis, which was with the city and Metro and Clackamas County, by that point, the state and the city had determined that the future of this site probably didn't involve saving everything, and it wasn't going to be a paper mill. And a lot of the reasons that were made those buildings significant, which was their industrial history as paper machines, was going to end. We went back and we evaluated the buildings individually, and I think that's where this problem or this misunderstanding is coming from. In that process, what was called the site stabilization analysis, there was a really amazing multidisciplinary team that was put together. The part of which that was focused on the buildings was myself looking at historic character and historic preservation issues. Mark Tobin from KPFF, structural engineers, looking at the capacity of the building structurally to be redeveloped or withstand water or whatever. And Chris DiLoretto from DiLoretto Architecture to look at their reuse potential. And the three of us brought together almost 100 years of experience to bring to this issue. And I don't know, I hope that you have seen that report, but in concert with SHPO and all of the various partners that were involved in this process, and to some degree the public, because we had public processes where we explained what we were doing, we came up with a 6-point review process for each of these buildings that allowed me to evaluate historic character individually on a scale of +3 to -3, historic character collectively, so the role that a building would play in the overall character of the site, +3 to -3. Chris DiLoretto got to analyze reuse potentials on 2 different levels from the same +3 to -3. And Mark Tobin from KPFF, the same for structure, for the costs of rehabilitation and the potential, the ability to even rehabilitate some of these buildings to meet code for alternate uses. Because we didn't know what the use was going to be for this site or any of these buildings, but we knew they weren't going to be paper mills. And so they were going to have to go through code compliance. And so any single building could have a maximum score, if you will, of +3s in 6 categories, 18 points, or -3s in 6 categories, -18 points. And it was a really interesting process. And if you look at the individual scores of the buildings that have come up tonight that people think might be more historic than they were evaluated, almost all of them, you will find, from the historic preservation standpoint, are in the +2 to +3 range. I would love to live in a world where historic preservationists got to tell everyone what to do, but we don't. And despite my evaluation against the Secretary of Interior standards that would give something a +3 or a +2, if it has no structure or no capacity to be reused for anything that is marketable or economically feasible, those other guys would bring it down. They would drop that number. And when we got to the end and we evaluated all of these things, we came up with 4 structures that had significant history, representing all of the various phases of this amazingly complex site that were still represented by buildings, that had good or at least potential rehabilitation opportunity, and that had good or potentially economically viable structural opportunity. And we came up with 4. And the one that dropped off and got added back in, which is how you have 5 must-keep buildings, are the foundations for the woolen mill. Because the foundations for the woolen mill aren't a building. As they sit, there's really no reuse for them in a normal sense. We had great discussions about whether or not you could get a tax credit for repointing the mortar and trying to turn them into a landscape feature. But we added them back in because they were so key. And the reason they were key and the reason these buildings were picked is that Mill O was related to the woolen mill. Mill number 1, finishing plant number 1, was related to the original development of Hawley. And Paper Machine 4 and the bleach plant were related to Hawley's expansion in the 20s. And the reason the bleach plant was kept was because that curtain wall along the street was considered a character-defining feature, that this was part of your downtown. I mean, prior to World War II, they were making paper and trolleys were going down the street and people were driving down there to go to the barber and the post office and whatever. And we thought that that type of development was an important thing to keep. So what we did was we came up with these 5 key structures. I think people are under the impression that any of us, whether Mark, Chris, or I, or anybody else on the team that was part of these decisions, think that that's all you got to keep. That's not the case. I hope they keep everything. I hope they come up with viable, economically plausible, structurally sound reasons to redevelop the whole thing. I think it'd be cool. I don't think it's possible, but it would be neat. We are fully cognizant that around those 5 buildings in what I dub the hen and chicks model, if you save Mill 1, which you have to under this process, that's one of the must-keep buildings, it would be illogical to tear down Paper Machine 1 adjacent to it. You would use that for some other sort of associated space. So I fully expect in the 5 buildings, once the developer goes through and figures out what's going to happen in these structures, that more of those non-identified buildings are also going to be retained. And that's exactly what we expected to happen as well. It's what we talked to SHPO about. It's what SHPO agreed with. And so the historic evaluation, I mean, I am in agreement with what's been said today. I think you should do an intensive survey. I think that the additional information that's been created is wonderful. I would give your librarian a medal for digitizing the papers, because that is just an incredible thing to have in any community. I think we already have a plan in place as part of this document before you to look at the archaeological inadvertent discovery. Much of this site is bedrock. The archaeologist, Rick Miner from Heritage Research Associates, was not convinced that there'll be much more other than industrial-related archaeology, but there will be some. And we should have a plan in place to protect that. But I am hesitant to see much modification to what needs to be saved as a baseline, because a lot of thought went into establishing those 5 buildings. And my guess is that in due diligence, any developer going forward is going to do all kinds of evaluation about the adjacent buildings, the chicks. There are buildings that are hard to demolish on this site. There are buildings that if you demolish, you can never build again because of where they're located. And so there is an incredible value, simply from an economic standpoint, of keeping these historic structures. And there's a great value historically and from a market standpoint, because that's what this site has to offer. So, to just sort of summarize, and I'm sure you'll have lots of questions, what we were attempting to do in a situation where knowability was a complete unknown. I mean, there was no knowability on this site for a developer. I think that that was reflected in the lack of interest from the initial bidders and actually in the ultimate sale price. I think by establishing this minimum historic preservation plan of the buildings you have to keep, it provided a level of knowability and the tools to move forward that I fully expect will result in the saving of more structures. And then I'll close and then answer your question. Since the digesters have come up, I'll just go ahead and tell you that Mill C and the digesters were exactly the characteristic that I explained. I gave them high marks for historic value. They're very historic structures or historic elements of the paper-making process. From a reuse potential, they're 4-foot tall cast iron vats in a steel framework that was rebuilt in the 50s that is covered in transite. So they are the ultimate example of an enclosure of a machine. And reusing them as anything other than interpretive material, which is what I said in this report, and which we fully expect. I'm thrilled that the salvagers didn't take it. Those big riveted cast iron panels, we can do something with those, and we should. But I can't imagine a scenario in which you could reuse them for anything unless you wanted to digest pulp. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions?
I could see using them as a base for an IMAX theater, or the astronomy thing where they project the lasers and the.
It's all inside them? Inside them? I think that's a great idea.
Just leave the walls as they are, and then just have a big like IMAX theater, screen inside. Built on top.
I hope somebody comes up with a way to reuse them. I mean, the Sputnik, what I call the Sputnik, and which I'm not supposed to call the Sputnik, but
we all do.
Yeah.
I've got a question, I believe, for Matt.
Sure. Go ahead.
I hear 2 words: developer and investor. Will the investor be scared off by just a menagerie of regulations that I've heard come before us tonight in terms of you ought to say this, you ought to do that, yada, 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 and so forth, which, I in due diligence, I think we ought to consider, but you got to look at in terms of reality, and the investor is taking a look at that, which you did originally, and say, whoa, wait just a minute here. I'm not going to advise somebody to spend $20 million to put a this or that on that site because of the unknowns.
Sure.
Versus the developer who, it would seem to me, if you want to have knowability, would come up with a master development plan on all of the building areas and say, this is what we can do. And this is what I'm going to encourage either my investors or I'm going to foot the bill on this, and this is how it's going to be. And this planning commission could take a look at it and see that the historic evaluation of the buildings had been accomplished and the utilities are there and public access is there. But what? No, it's just a patchwork that we're going to have to, in good faith, take that leap of faith and get out of the way and let the developers and the city do its job in order to get this built out over the next, 25 years?
Sure. Yes, 25 years, 20 years, 5 years. You know, we just don't know, right? I mean,
so,
it's
so what we're talking about here, the concept of the economic environment may not exist 25 years that you're talking about tonight.
That's right. So I mean, I think there's a couple things there to kind of tease out. So one is, you know, I always view these processes when you're talking about long time frames, when you're talking about a complex site, right? It's a process of just kind of knocking off piece by piece. What are some of the impediments that we see in front of us to getting where we need to be? So until we have a master plan, right, that's been approved and adopted for this site, there's no clear pathway for a developer to understand how they can get to a potential development plan for their site. They don't know, right? I mean, today it's zoned industrial. There's no real kind of sense for what I would need to go through. The intent of this master plan, obviously, is to provide that framework so that it's like, here's the path you can go down, or potentially paths, right? So there's two paths I think that a developer could take, and one of them is kind of building on what you outlined. So one path is, I want to look at this site as a whole, come up with a master development plan for the site, understand specifically what it is I want to propose, and then come to the city with a specific master plan proposal, right, that outlines in much greater detail than what we're looking at right now. Here's the approach I'm going to take.
Like a planned unit development type approach.
Similar to that, okay. I would think so. The second approach would be to use the master plan that we're adopting tonight and essentially bring in, on a site-by-site basis, right, here's a proposal for block 1, you know, and I'm using the design guidelines and the development standards that are included in the master plan, and that's how the project gets essentially reviewed and approved. So, I mean, there's two potential paths that someone could take on this project in front of them. The important part right now is that there is a path, right, versus what we have before. So the knowability, you know, that the term that George used there, I think is great. You know, I mean, we're going to know a lot more once this plan is approved than when we did. I think, you know, I'll go back to the gap analogy, right? I mean, because I don't want to leave you with the impression that it's something that's insurmountable, that you can't be overcome. But there's essentially, we've created 4 strategies for overcoming that gap. First is to transform the site, right? Turn it into something else that you know, allows it to kind of transcend the market. That means taking advantage of the river, taking advantage of the falls, taking advantage of this great setting on the site, providing public access. The second is to invest in the site, looking at public infrastructure, public utilities, potentially parking to help support, you know, some of the visitation that we see coming there. The third is what we're talking about tonight, which is kind of removing barriers, you know, being able to provide a pathway for someone to get to where they want. And frankly, the fourth element is what always comes up in this, is that the developer is taking risk. You know, as much as we want to sit here today and look at this site and say, I can't imagine this not being a success, right? Because as developers, as planners, as forward thinkers, I mean, it's hard to do this and not be optimistic and not say that it's going to be a success. But the other element of overcoming that is at some point someone is putting their own assets on the line and taking the risk to make something happen.
Well, the city is a partner in this. They're
Absolutely.
Going to take some risk too.
Absolutely.
Now, if this was a plat or a subdivision, those streets would be platted and dedicated to the city after the public facilities were improved.
Yes.
Water lines and sewer lines,
That's right.
et cetera, and turned over to the city for maintenance.
Yep.
But those would be the cost of the developer.
In a typical suburban subdivision, that is correct.
And this is not
Yeah.
happening in this regard because it's not being platted.
Well, we don't know that.
Well, we still
Well, it
don't
hasn't
know.
been proposed yet.
Yeah, it hasn't been proposed yet. Someone at some point will have to come in and do that. Now, of course, no, Main Street's been vacated. I'm sorry. I was going to say it's there, but it's not.
It is, but it isn't.
It is, but it isn't. You know, at some point, and the city also has to come to some conclusion about whether they want to accept a public street in that area, or whether it's actually a private street over an easement, or, you know, I mean, there's a lot of discussion that still has to occur about what form that takes. You know, it is a partnership. It's been intended to be viewed as a partnership. And in a partnership, I think part of it is trying to mitigate the risks for the other partners and really trying to collaborate and move something forward that's to the great benefit of both, right? Not just one or the other. So There are still, the adoption of the framework plan does not, solve every issue, but it removes a number of barriers that are in front of us right now.
Are there other questions
Yeah.
from the commission?
I do.
In the Eco Northwest market analysis report, I think the thesis statement in this is the definition of the gap between current market rents and values and actual development costs for higher density of urban development on the site. Ideas for addressing those gaps. I think you could write a whole nother report on developing those ideas to address the gaps, because I think that's where really the rubber meets the road in terms of whether or not you're going to be able to make this development, quote unquote, and I hate to use this term, pencil out. But I think that those barriers are, I agree with you, I think they're unknown. And if you don't know how many, structures you're going to have to preserve, that's a huge issue for you. And then if you don't know what the process by which those structures are to be designated and the process by which those structures are to be designed once you implement, those are really big, long timelines that you're going to have to, and a lot of costly aspects to that. So I don't know when that would come into this analysis, but I'm just wondering how, or if, I'm sure you've thought about it, and you've come up with some other factors.
I think the plan lays out, George kind of walked through the analysis of how we got to those 5 buildings, right? It lays out what we think are the important buildings that have to be considered as part of the process moving forward. And I think there are economically viable uses that are possible for those buildings, and potentially more. But in my mind, what this does is it gives a very clear direction to the site. I think there's a balance here, right? Because we're not just, the easy way from an economic development standpoint would just be to say you don't have to preserve anything, right? And it makes the site a lot easier to pencil. But at the same time, you end up giving a lot away, right, in terms of what you're really trying to accomplish in terms of your other priorities, character of the site, creating a destination, building on the success of downtown, things like that.
Right.
So, it's a little bit more art than science right now in terms of trying to understand what does it take to make an area like this successful. We don't think just all new ground-up development is that. It has to incorporate a unique sense of place. It has to take advantage of the character and the history of the site. And we think this is striking the right balance. And in my opinion, it provides a very clear path for the developer in terms of being able to understand exactly what they need to do to either save buildings or propose to remove buildings. There's a clear path that they will have to make, and a decision they have to make, and a process they have to go through to do that. So, I think we're light years beyond where we were at the beginning of this process in terms of defining that and providing some certainty for a developer.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that maybe some of these buildings on the outside will look like really viable candidates for preservation, but then once you get into the actual development of those, it might be costly prohibitive to do it. So maybe there's a compromise of perhaps adaptively reusing some of these buildings and then designating them afterwards. I don't know, but and maybe those are some of the ways of getting around some of those barriers. But some of the buildings probably ought to be designated, of course, beforehand, so that they are preserved as they are, but maybe we need to pick and choose which ones those are. I'm not sure.
If I may.
Yeah.
The intent is that you would identify that the 5 buildings, or at least the 4, not counting the foundations. And my expectation is that a developer, knowing that they have to renovate those, would seek a way to renovate them and take advantage of the various tax incentives that are available only to National Register listed property. And so that would happen before. And they would have the option, as they were putting that plan together for a specific building, to save some of the surrounding structures and perhaps designate them as part of the same, the Mill 1 complex or the Paper Machine 4 complex. And that was what we were trying to create, was that sort of opportunity, with the expectation they would list the properties individually.
It's kind of a slippery slope because we want to have as much safeguards in terms of preservation and environmental review as we possibly can, but then we don't want to implement so many barriers or guidelines, if you will. We like to call them guidelines, not barriers, but that we chase people away from the site, and it makes it undevelopable. So I don't know where that medium is, and I'll.
Right.
I don't either, but I think if anybody is interested in coming here to develop and they don't have an understanding of what this place is about, then I'm not really sure as a community we really want that type of an entity to be developing here. And I think we have to be a little bit choosy in some regard so that, it's not, I guess the word would be every Tom, Dick, Harry, and Jane, because there are some women developers out there that might want to look at this from a different standpoint. So I think, again, like anything involving preservation, I think we want to encourage and support someone who has some experience in that area, who has some vision. I know that my dear, dear friend Art DeMuro is no longer with us, but we need some more Art DeMuros out there. He's somebody that could look at something, and while one person sees a bunch of rusty metal, whoever that person is or persons are going to see something else. And I think everything should be in until it's out at this point. We have too much history there to disregard parts. And I totally agree with what you're saying, George. I just don't know how to put that into some sort of a statement that says, this is our intent as development of this master plan, that, maybe there are hens and chicks. I don't know how to say that. And maybe there's a way to say that.
Okay.
Other questions?
I had some comments about something, Matt, you said. Something I thought when I brought it up last meeting, it was so minute, I didn't think anybody even listened to it. And I was talking about the bridge crossing over 99. And the reason I brought that up, and I'm still kind of stuck on that one, is if I'm not sure where you were referring to, where they had an option to go across the street or take the bridge, but they probably didn't have a tunnel that came right out there, less than a block, where they were going to cross in the 99 that comes around this way, because both of those come together there. Plus Main Street is the West Lynn Bridge. Now that I have a storefront that's right next to the West Lynn Bridge, people are swearing.
Oregon City West Lynn Bridge.
Yes, Oregon City West Lynn Bridge.
Lynn Bridge.
I hear tires squealing. I hear people swearing at each other and honking because people are coming off that bridge so fast,
Yes, they are.
and they're
Tom,
trying
you
to
need stop swearing at them.
Yeah, really. I'm like, no, stop here. But that corner right there, where people would be crossing from the current downtown Main Street to the other, that is a dangerous crossing for people. And if we're going to have a lot of tourists and we're going to draw more people there, people with children are going to be crossing that area. Seniors like myself are going to try and cross that area. And you only have a short time to get across that from one Main Street to the extension of it on the other side. And that's why I suggested it last time, because that is a blind corner. As these people speed down through that tunnel or coming around the other way, the combination of all three streets coming to that one intersection, it's going to be hard for tourists and other people to cross over there safely. Because I've tried it already in the last month and a half, parking down there and trying to run across on crutches.
Are you talking about being down at the mill and crossing?
Yes, that area there, and we just cross the crisscrossing.
Crossing Main Street from Mill to downtown.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that whole
I didn't know
area.
if you were talking about trying to cross from Ridgeview, Brewing, across to
No,
where ECT
that's
is.
also bad enough.
I know. That's where I was at about 4:45 today, and it was.
But-
Let's just say that I nearly got nailed by somebody.
I've heard there's been some bad
looking
accidents
around
there.
that corner.
And I currently don't know what the traffic situation is there, how many car accidents or people have been hit, because there's not a lot of traffic going into that site right now, and that's something that probably should be studied, but that's why I brought it up, and I was pleased to hear you approach it, even though you thought that most people would probably go the straight path rather than go over. It made me start thinking, when I was in college in the 60s down at Portland State, that was my first protest. We were on Broadway, and we kept walking back and forth across Broadway to prove a point that the students couldn't get over to the parking garage until they finally built that overpass on Broadway.
That bridge right there. And there's a case, right, where you're on the second floor of a building and you go right across into the second floor of another building, and it
Yeah,
makes a lot of
that's good.
sense. And I'll give you my bias on this, and my bias is that in an area like downtown Oregon City, right, the priority should be on the pedestrian.
Right, not cars.
Okay. I know it's 99E. I know it's a state highway. I know that people in Canby are trying to get somewhere else, right? But when you're talking about trying to connect these areas, it's worth a good amount of the traffic signal time there to be dedicating towards the people on foot that are trying to get around and enjoy the place. So I understand, like on other parts of 99E, you might make a different choice. I think here we want to really emphasize the fact this is a place for people, right, and that cars are visitors, right. The people and the pedestrians should be here first. But that's my own bias as well. Especially when you're talking about areas like this, which really depend on the quality of the pedestrian environment, the pedestrian connections that you're able to create.
I think it also point out in our discussions with the Oregon Department of Transportation for the MMA designation for this area, one of the improvements is improved electronic signage and safety signage as you're coming down 99E from Tumward into that tunnel, to one, slow people down, and then to potentially alert them that the lights changed ahead, expect stop traffic ahead in the blind corner as you're coming through the tunnel. So I would echo what Matt says. This is a special transportation area designation along 99E from the Clackamas River to the tunnel for the train, which does get us focusing on bike and ped access and slowing the speeds on 99E through that section. So we have the tools in place to begin that process to ensure that we can start to address some of those. How do we get people safely across, and how does this become part of Main Street rather than these two separate entities right adjacent to one another? I would also point out that Phase 3 of the McLaughlin Boulevard plan, which would get us to the tunnel, so it's the southern section there that hasn't been completed yet. We haven't designed that yet, but there is an opportunity back by the courthouse. There's stairs that go down underneath 99E. Maybe it's an undercrossing there that then you walk along a New Willamette Terrace that then ties into the Riverwalk and you're into the site, thereby bypassing 99E. So I think there's options, and it's obviously something that both with that MMA designation, safety, both vehicular and pedestrian, are going to continue to be monitored, and if improvements are necessary, we'll start to address those.
Are there any other questions by the commissioners?
I have. First, I guess it's a general comment. One is that 99E doesn't need to be 45. Milwaukee's already proven that they can be 25.
It works.
Which greatly.
It's actually 30.
Well, and
through them.
it wasn't when I got my ticket.
I can tell you it's 30 today. 30 today.
But the other, I guess, element is we have a copy of your mill, CG, and carpentry shop assessment in here. Has the entire assessment been entered into the record of all 50?
It has. It was
Okay.
entered into the record the first night last September 8th. It's in the record. It's attached to that agenda. What I did is I highlighted those 3 forms because they were brought up specifically,
Right.
but the whole site stabilization report is attached to the September 8th agenda.
Okay. I probably saw it and glazed over.
I think it's the last link
Okay.
on the.
Because that, I think, would be a really good thing to sit down and look at both of the documents. Okay, I guess that's it. Thanks.
I guess I just want to echo what you heard here tonight in terms of it was one of the things that we struggled with of what do you do. You walk on the site, there's about 600,000 square feet of structures that exist there, 58, I think, unique buildings we ended up identifying. So, I hope that you take into consideration pretty strongly the work that was done by multiple professionals in multiple fields. If you look at it through one lens, you miss the larger picture of both the opportunities and limitations. So to bring forward something, I think it's one of our weaknesses sometimes in planning is that we don't take the next step. And I believe in this exercise that we did, we took multiple steps to try to make sure we had a realistic understanding of something that could be constructed on the site that balances all 4 of those values. And so a great deal of work that George and the team went through in trying to be very thoughtful and deliberative in reviewing all of the structures on the site because it hadn't happened before. And it was so important. We knew it would be. It's so important to how that site's redeveloped. It really does tell the story of what happened there. But to just throw everything on there and say, come and improve while you can't have it, we believe we've done a lot of work to try to get you to a point where you can be comfortable with what has been brought forward.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with the 5 buildings, and then the last last week you had a slide where a bunch of them were purple. And just saying, the developer is strongly encouraged to, and whatever that strongly encouragement might be, reduced SDCs or additional grants or whatever. I think at a certain point you got to say stop, and so that there is some certainty, and whether it's hen and chicks or sow and piglets or whatever you want to call it, it's up to the person who's putting money on the table to determine what they're going to do. And if certain groups want to say, we really want to keep the Pullery, and I'm willing to throw $50,000 grant at the guy to help him redevelop it, great. But the thing to look at, if you want to get real historic about the thing, is there's no buildings there, and it's just a bunch of Indians snatching eels out of the river. And so how historic do we want to get comes down to, how much money are we willing to put into it. And maybe there's 1 or 2 more buildings, but I think the assessment that was done is a good baseline to start forward. And as other master plans come forward, whether it's block by block or the whole area or whatever, that's when the encouragement to work with the purple buildings, I guess, for lack of a better term, is really the time to do that.
Can we get it? We did not get a copy of that particular slide, the one that Damon's talking about that showed building. It was in last week's presentation.
Yeah, it was last week, not this week.
Yeah, not this week.
Right. I really appreciate what the other commissioners have been saying, and I appreciate both Matt and George what you've brought to the table here, and kind of going off of what Tony has said. I think that the fact that we have a vision for the site, the 4 values that have been established, is critical to the success of the overall development. But as an architect, my experience, and I've been involved in several historic renovations, is that what you've talked about, the viability of these buildings for reuse, especially when they've been used for a very specialized use. So changing that building and using it for something completely different is a big challenge. In any case, even if it's a new building, to take a building and use it for a totally different use is a big challenge. The other thing that I think most people don't recognize is that these buildings that were built 50, 60, 100 years ago don't come anywhere close to meeting current codes, and that's a gigantic obstacle.
In particular, seismic.
And seismic, accessibility, energy, I mean, you can go on and on and on. And I think the key to making some of these buildings go from the not viable to viable side is, like Damon was saying, if there's some financial incentives to doing that. I've personally worked with a developer who shelled out way more money to renovate a historic building than you could financially justify. And we were all scratching our head trying to figure out why he was doing this. But when you have, for example, stone foundations, there is no code for stone foundations that you can pencil out in today's code. And with accessibility, most of those buildings are going to be a huge challenge to make viable for reuse in a completely different use. So I appreciate the approach that you have taken to identify the must-keep ones and the ones that would be really great to keep if they can be made financially viable. And I think that goes hand in hand with what Damon was talking about. If we can find a mechanism to give the developer the incentive to salvage those buildings. And frankly, it may be a case where you build a building within a building. You're actually building a use inside a shell and not trying to necessarily make that shell the final structure. So that may be an approach that can be taken. But I appreciate, and I don't necessarily have a question for you, but I just appreciate the approach that you've taken to this.
I've got one more.
Bob?
I think that both sides are asked to take a giant leap of faith on this. And I think that what's going to make this site successful and viable is the scenic access and the public investment that they're going to get involved with on the falls. That is just monumental, both emotionally, traditionally, you just name it. I mean, we owe it to the public to do this, and you do too. You owe it to your client, because that's what's going to make this site successful. When investors see people enjoying themselves and coming to that site, they're going to want to be part of it. And I'm a little concerned about the public involvement in terms of investment for utilities until this thing gets decided one way or another, whether it's going to be platted or it's going to just operate on easements or how that's going to be. I'm a little concerned about that. I think that it's going to be a long build out, and there's going to be a big change in this planning commission, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. So there'll be other people, other players making decisions that they're not going to be privy to for tonight's decision. But I'm going to take that leap of faith and trust. I believe in you guys taking that big risk, and I hope that, is it Ben? Okay, I hope that Ben, by the time we're done, he'll probably grow hair. That's your reward, man. Getting through this.
I don't think it works.
I'm looking forward to that. I just, if I might make just one quick comment on that. I do think, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, I think, I've been advocating for public investment in the Riverwalk on its own merits, right, for quite a while now in this process. I think it's the first important step that's needed in not only transforming the perception of the site, but also in really giving the public access to a site they have not had access to in over 100 years. Really, really critical. It stands on its own. The other investments that you talk about, in my mind, are contingent. They're contingent on your partner stepping up and being able and willing to commit to certain things, right? So I am never an advocate for a public body investing in something on the hopes or aspirations that something else might happen, right? And so I think when you get to talking about the other investments that might be necessary on the site and how or whether the public is involved in those, streets, utilities, infrastructure, parking, things like that, I think it's contingent on strong commitments from the private sector to step up and match those in time and at a level that you feel is appropriate. So I would highlight that as a future discussion as well.
Thank you. Christina?
Just real briefly, I wanted to add Exhibit B into the record. Those are the public comments you have on your dais that you received today. Those are public comments I have received in my office since I last sent you the revised, as well as the addition of the amendment to the Willamette Falls Downtown District, which specifically identifies food and beverage production as part of the light industry. I think it just helps everyone in the future, 6 years down the road. We always intended it. Just write it in. So that's my recommendation. And all of that is Exhibit B.
Would you forward a copy of this slide to all of us by email?
Yeah. And this is in the record as well. Absolutely.
At this point, I think it depends on if you're inclined to make a decision today. If you are inclined to make a decision today, I would encourage you to allow the public to testify one more time in response to sort of the things that they heard from the applicant, just to close the loop there. And then if you do want to make a decision today, we'll make a decision and then come back with findings next meeting. You would close the public hearing after you hear from anybody in the public who still wants to speak. We would then, the record would be closed at that point. If you come back after reviewing the materials you received tonight and want to reopen the record when we come back on Monday, we can certainly do that. I'm talking about the following Monday, the next Monday.
It's next Monday, a week from today.
So we can certainly do that, but I think it's up to you to decide if you want to close the record, make a decision today, allow people to testify, or if you want to just come back and sort of start where we did today with taking more testimony.
And just remember that this is a recommendation to the City Commission, unless there is a denial.
But the record is closed before the City Commission. So.
Yeah, I'm not interested in closing the record and making a decision tonight. I think we've got the opportunity for next week. We've got a lot of information, and I have some more questions for staff. So,
Yeah, I'm not either.
Indian,
That's fine with me.
you in agreement?
Sure.
So we'll keep
Forgot
the.
to ask Zach.
He,
Oh, I couldn't see you. I couldn't see you nodding.
Yeah.
So you can still hear from the public tonight if you want to some more, or you can.
Oh, I think we should allow as much opportunity tonight for testimony.
Right, and I'd say, unless the commission has any more comments to make right now, we can just go ahead and invite the public to
There are more slips?
make any. I don't have any slips, but is there anyone in the audience that would like to speak again? Come on up.
So if you have a slip, we have a slip, and if you've not, you can. If you're new, if you haven't made a comment, you can grab a slip at the back counter.
So just reintroduce yourself. Check and see if your mic is on.
How's that?
Yeah.
Make a very brief comment, because I think there's, and this map helps make that comment. I think there's a really simple compromise. The buildings in red, from my understanding of the plan, are the ones that are required for preservation.
Mm-hmm.
I think the simple solution to the balance between, historic preservation and, the concerns expressed is to simply have the National Register buildings, and again, I'm not really sure that I agree that the water treatment plant is eligible for National Register, but those buildings that are not included in red have all of the National Register eligible buildings as purple buildings.
Yeah,
because that doesn't force the developer to do anything. But one of the things I think if you're going out for SEDCs for grants, etc., I can't see a state agency or a foundation taking seriously a request for funding as seriously, independently, as if it's part of the plan. If you say we want 50 grand to help the Pullery, it's part of our plan. See, I don't think a funding agency would take that as seriously if it's not in the plan, as opposed to if it were in the plan. So I think that the purple classification allows the flexibility while still emphasizing as a community value those buildings that we as a community think are important. So that's what I would suggest, is that except for the water treatment plant, all of the National Register eligible buildings be at least purple classification.
Yeah, I thought there was a lot more when I saw the slide before.
Yeah, I thought there was too.
Yeah. So that's it. Yeah, and if you get up to 14 buildings out of that's still not a lot of buildings out of 55 on the site. So that's.
Is there anyone else who would like to speak at this time?
Good evening. My name is Jesse Buss. I live here in the neighborhood. My comments are not cohesive yet. I was actually planning on submitting them in writing later this week and/or speaking next week. So my primary comment now is to ask you to keep the record open for at least a few more days so that can be submitted. I know a few other people who are planning to come as well.
Yeah, it's going to be open through next week. So no.
Then I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Yep.
we need to talk about archaeological.
Elaine Dorsett, representing the Oregon Archaeological Society. So the statement was made a few minutes ago in reference to apparently Rick Miner making a statement that he felt that there was not much more than industrial deposits left at this site, and possibly not much in the way of sediment. And I understand that he was probably paid to give his opinion on that subject, which is fine. That's totally common. But archaeology is a science, and if he has some data to support that opinion, to bring it into the realm of hypothesis, I would like to know where to get that information. But in the absence of any data, it is just an opinion, and without testing, if you have a hypothesis, you have to test it. So, which is where it comes into the realm of what we were suggesting as far as an archaeological testing project before we get into trouble, essentially.
I think that makes sense. Rick Miner worked for the furnace, the Lake Oswego iron furnace rehabilitation, and he was I think he was the head archaeologist for that, and did quite a job on the pre-Columbian and pioneer resources that were on that site.
I have no doubt that his statement is based on a lot of experience working with our industrial sites. My point is just that it has to be tested. Sure. In order to really be able to say, to sit here and make this definitive statement that, this statement was made that there's nothing there. Okay, that's fine. It's a statement, but it's not proven at this point.
You need facts.
Yes.
You want some facts.
Yeah. Archaeology science works on data.
Are you talking about testing the entire site?
Well, what you would set up would be a testing project where you would test a certain pattern of areas. One thing that's been suggested when I've been talking to city people is testing in the areas of the streets, which there would be a certain ease in doing that because there's no buildings there. But it's not going to give you a lot of information because they've always been streets. Even in old Oregon City, that was a street. So you're not going to expect to find any building foundations or anything that might be...
Or kitchen middens.
Or kitchen middens in, maybe sheet trash in the street, but not necessarily a midden, right?
What about arrowheads?
Possible. We don't...
So if you do, then what's the next step?
It depends on how intense the quantity of artifacts is. It depends on what features you find. There would be consultation. There would be a recommendation by the archaeologist. This area shows evidence of building foundations from the earliest days of Oregon City. The archaeologist would recommend that this area is eligible for the National Register and it should not be disturbed. Or the owner would, depending on the significance of the deposits, the archaeologist may suggest that a data recovery project where it's completely excavated be utilized as a mitigation for destroying that part of the site, so that you get that information, all of the information that's possible to get out of those archaeological deposits before it's destroyed. It also could even go to the level, if it happened to be that the McLaughlin House Foundation still existed underneath the building, that might be a place where the archaeologist would recommend that this site not be disturbed, and that whatever development plan was already in place to possibly destroy that site would have to be changed. So there can be a whole range of treatments depending on how significant the deposits are. So it's going to be variable across the site. If there are, certainly even the industrial deposits can be significant. Anything over 75 years old has that potential. It's not, you can't make a blanket statement for the whole site. It's going to be highly variable across the site.
I would imagine that you have some guidelines that could be used during any demolition process or excavation process for evaluation of the as the work was proceeding, so that if any artifacts were encountered during a demolition or excavation, that those could be preserved and evaluated.
It would involve, if you're going to want to have archaeological deposits identified during any demolition or ground disturbing process, you're going to need to have archaeological monitors. Construction people are not qualified. That's not their job.
Do you have guidelines for how that would be accomplished?
They're generally set up specifically to a project, but yes, guidelines would be developed. And then curation is another issue. Any development that you have on this site is going to generate artifacts, whether they're of the industrial period or the early Oregon City or prehistoric. And a plan needs to be in place for what's going to happen to those artifacts so that they're curated and taken care of. So that's another aspect of it. So.
Would you be prepared to work with the city to provide guidelines for that process?
As a representative of the Oregon Archaeological Society, we could probably work with that. Yeah.
Looks like we might need to amend a couple of the staff's suggested conditions to add archaeological sites. We talk a lot about the buildings, as she stated. We have more there than just the built environment.
Oh, there is a condition of approval.
An existing condition.
Yeah, it's on.
I think.
Yeah, there is a condition in there that is it any place that may possibly have archaeological
It's with
deposits.
consultation with SHPO.
I think that's adequate.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else that would like to speak this evening? Okay. Christina, do you have anything else for us?
I don't have anything at time, but I'm going to pass it over.
I think I heard someone had some other stuff for us. And
Yeah, I thought we were going to go through some of this, since that's the only thing we have on the agenda. So are we closing the public hearing and leaving the record open? Are we continuing the public hearing so we can
Continuing the
so we
public
can have
hearing so that the record remains open, so that anybody can submit anything. But we want to hear your concerns, questions, revisions, so that we can make them, so we come back with further revisions.
Okay, so
What she said.
We'll close the public hearing for tonight, but leave the record open till next Monday.
Yeah.
So, do we want to go through the matrix? Is that what you want to go through?
I've got questions that go back to the original staff report because I had time to
Finally
chug
reread
through
it.
it. So.
Okay, well, why don't we do that first, and then we can go through the matrix.
Perfect. I'd like that.
Right, so wait for Christina to find her original staff report.
Tell us what page you're on.
Page 33.
Oh.
You know what?
That's the one thing you don't
I
have.
think I left it in my car. Hold on.
See, and that's cooperation between
Oh, sweet.
public-private cooperation.
And I left mine.
Did you make any changes, Ben?
The edited version.
It's all PDF.
So there is the last recommended thing that says, and everything else is irrelevant.
So page 33.
Yeah, that's the mitigation matrix.
Yes.
The very last box there about traffic and transportation, it says, package of improvements in and near the site to mitigate impacts includes a signal at 6th and 99E.
Correct. That's what the applicant first initially proposed, but at this point, ODOT has recommended the removal of that signal, and that was part of our additional findings.
Okay, so the recommended removal of putting in a signal.
Correct.
Because I was going to say that's a really weird spot to put a signal. Okay. I noticed basically throughout the document there's places where you have triple asterisks and then no explanation of what the triple asterisks are about.
Checking on page 34.
Yeah, page 34 and page 58.
We're talking about under the flood management area standards.
Yeah.
And also on the statement of principle on page 34.
Right.
I think that's identifying that these are asterisks are indicating that these are a summarization of the statement of principles, the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan is such a large document. This was
That's fine, but you need to have a these asterisk mean
Footnote.
so that
You're talking about a footnote.
yeah. Let's see. Page 46. You there, Christine? Okay.
Sorry, I'm waiting for her. I'm looking at page 46.
Third and fifth paragraphs seem to be kind of referring to what became condition 16, which was then eliminated. So are those paragraphs relevant anymore?
Well, I'll kind of send it back to our Carrie Richter, our attorney, but I think the goal is that as we move forward and adopt, and the Planning Commission provides additional findings, what gets sent back with the revised finding of facts will incorporate that. So this is the base staff report.
Okay.
Then with the then we had the proposal by the applicant to remove that. We agreed, and as the Planning Commission moves forward with the revised, those findings and facts will update this base staff report.
Okay, I just, but those
Planning
basically.
Commission's recommendation will look different than the
Right, no,
staff.
yeah, I understand. But those paragraphs did basically refer to condition 16.
Correct.
Okay. Just want to make sure I was also putting it in the right brain. Let's see.
I should go need one highlighter.
Yeah, it's not nearly as much fun.
The highlighter is good fun.
Page 76. And this kind of goes from 76 on through the whole street design thing. There's multiple comments about the street design standards are not applicable because they're not proposing any new streets.
As part of this development application, the detailed development plan, I think this goes back to what Commissioner Mahoney identified as at the time of the detailed development plan is actually the development application where the determination of the right-of-way or access easement, that specific decision will be made at the time of detailed development plan.
Okay, I kind of thought this document was about all this level of the master plan was that Main Street, 3rd, 4th, and Water were going to come back.
Correct, and that's and that's kind of this differentiation of we're creating the framework, but it's the act of a detailed plan submission is the act of the development approval for that parcel. We're creating the framework.
So
But
under this,
let me just comment, and because this goes right to what Matt was talking about. That there's two options. The developer can come to us with an overall development plan, or they could come in with a development plan by parcel.
Correct. If you recall, we have a condition of approval that says the first time you come in with a detailed development plan, you need to turn in an infrastructure phasing plan. And it's that infrastructure phasing plan. So even if you have, kind of path A, path B, let's take the more iterative path B. I come in with a building, either I'm rehabbing or I'm building new. I'm coming in with my phasing plan. And at that time, there's going to be decisions made of how if we agree with that phasing plan or if we want to make amendments to that phasing plan. But it's that we've triggered that to the first development application.
So are we at that point then saying that the developer has to submit the standards that Damon's saying are absent right now? At that time, they have to. That's the trigger.
Or maybe it's a different standard.
Right.
We're trying to create that strong Main Street with the east-west connections out to the river and the Riverwalk, as well as an alternative connection along Water Avenue and the reestablishment of 4th Avenue. Now, is 4th Avenue going to be designed with a 53-foot right-of-way, or is it going to be designed with a 60-foot right-of-way with 10-foot sidewalks or 8-foot? I mean, it really depends on what's next to it. I mean, it's context sensitive to what's going to come in. So to just arbitrarily go grab our local street standard at this point didn't make sense, but I believe that we've put in a strong framework that says north-south, Main Street, and then strong PED connections from Main Street connecting back to the river. So that's the framework part of it. Now, whether the right-of-way is 50 feet, 48, or 62, that's part of the detailed plan.
yeah, and I understand that. It's just, I guess what I'm concerned with is that right now, the developer could come in with Main Street and a half dozen sidewalks. If we're not going to say that Third, Fourth, and Water will also, I mean, we're going to the level of design standard of saying you can have wider sidewalks on Main Street. Why aren't we going to at least to the step of saying Third, Fourth, and Water will also at some point at some standard be.
Well, I think we are. We have our adopted city standards about what a local commercial street looks like. The key thing we were changing is we were asking for something above and beyond what the local standard was requiring. That was the extra width of the sidewalk. So we had to specifically at the master plan, this framework plan level, legally propose a wider sidewalk. As we come in with the Third and Fourth, we have our adopted street standards. What we're saying is, it's that Main Street connection, we see the wider sidewalk, but we see for the Third and Fourth, we have sufficient existing street standards to address it. And even differently, there may be a modification to that street standard, but we didn't see the need to require any additional required width for any individual dimension.
Well,
but the Planning Commission could adopt and approve an alternate design that was context sensitive at the time of the master plan, if that made sense.
That would be the only time I'd want to do it.
Mm-hmm. But we needed
Not
to
at this
add the
level.
addition of the sidewalk width as part of this project.
Are we going to be left with half-street improvements, though, if the developer wants to develop Block A and nothing more, but he improves to the middle of the street?
That's a very that's what we usually deal with, right? If you think about a subdivision and we come in with half street, this phasing plan is going to be very different. They're going to come in with what their best guess is of how do we phase the implementation of this project, and we've tied it to the first one in, so they're going to have some idea of how they're going to phase it. And it's up to the Planning Commission to say, we think that phasing plan is reasonable, or they can say that your phasing plan is not reasonable.
So a phasing plan is triggered by that first development.
Correct. And they're going to have, hopefully the idea is you'll have more understanding. And then, like all of these infrastructure and phasing plans, as new development comes in, you're probably going to see a slight revision every time to their phasing plan. And now we know more information. Here's more detailed information.
Okay.
Third building comes in, we know a little bit more now, and here it is. And it's how do you come up with that proportional phasing that we're all going to be scratching our head around, and the Planning Commission is going to be able to look at again at the detailed development plan
I
level.
don't see how else you could do that.
Mm-hmm.
Unless the developer went in there and completely improved the streets and the sidewalks and the infrastructure, and he did that, then you'd have it uniform.
Sure.
But in any case, that would be a byproduct of that first development
The phasing
proposal.
plan. Yeah.
The first
They're gonna-
submittal.
Yeah, they're going to come up with their best guess of how they're going to get water, sewer, private facility, private utilities, and the street phasing to the best that they know based on what they have. And then it's going to, the Planning Commission is always going to be able to look at the phasing plan and how it's meeting, and if it needs to be tweaked and adjusted each time, as new development comes in, we get more information.
Okay, but it still doesn't get back to my original question, which is, at what point and how do we impose Third, Fourth, and Water on this development?
At the time of the detailed development plan.
How?
Because the framework plan lays out the need for a strong pedestrian and vehicular plan. If they come in and deviate from that, you're going to have the opportunity to review that and make a decision whether they're complying with the intent of the framework master plan if it's adopted tonight.
But
I don't think it's realistic to think they're going to come in here with just sidewalks. We have a condition that requires them to put a right turn lane right in, right out for Water Avenue to alleviate some of the pressure on Main. I mean, it's implied that there's going to be a vehicular access down Water and Fourth.
But they gotta have street frontage, right?
Yes.
I mean, you can't develop a landlocked piece of property.
Well, but see, that's the right in, right out to Water could be directly to the parking structure where they tear down the postal building and build a parking structure. And then it doesn't go any further than that half a block. And that any other, let me finish, please. Everybody keeps interrupting, and I want to finish my statement, and then I'll gladly listen to everything else. Then the developer could, instead of imposing Third Street, build a really long building with an archway where pedestrians could walk through without entering the building and still make it to the Riverwalk. And it could be nice and wide and broad and all bricked and beautiful with birds and unicorns. But it still isn't a street. And they could, and especially when you start looking at the street towards the side of the bluff, where we've got two of our historic buildings constraining the development. It's a real good location to just put a sky bridge over it and a walking path to another parking structure that's along the railroad to buffer the noise. So at this point, this is our 30,000 foot flyover. This is what it's supposed to look like. I don't see any protection for Third, Fourth, and Water. And I can think of a lot of ways to build around still meeting the obligation, but not having those protections in this.
But not if that first phase plan is not accepted. They have to.
It needs to come back to you.
I understand.
So if they submit the plan that you were just describing that's non-compliant.
How is it non-compliant?
Because it doesn't meet the standards.
How does it not meet the standards? If you have an on and off for water that goes to a parking structure, which takes care of excessive parking concerns, and there is public access from Main Street to the Riverwalk, how does that not meet the standards?
Connectivity that's required within the framework plan.
What
doesn't allow
connectivity? Pedestrians and bicycles can get where they need to go. There's no reason to build Third or Fourth, conceivably.
I can come up with all kinds of hypotheticals. I think that the intent of the master plan clearly states that the objective is for Water Street and Fourth to alleviate the transportation trips at the intersection of 99E in Maine.
It's shown on the map.
It's shown on the map. I'm not sure what else. I mean, are you looking for a dedication? I mean, I'm not sure. If you go back and look at the intent and the whole idea of why we were reestablishing the original grid was to provide that connectivity.
It has to look like the picture.
Yeah, but you notice Third is hatch marked. So does that mean it's a concept of where a street might be, or?
Well, they probably have that hashed in there because of the locations of buildings and other constraints on the site. So they might have that location pinpointed.
So
it still has to be there.
So anyway, I'm on the record as being concerned. Nobody else is concerned. We'll move on.
Well, don't shortchange yourself, Tim. I agree with what he's saying. What we want is, I think what the public deserves is a certain amount of certainty in terms of placement of utilities, including streets and sidewalks. What would be wrong with referring to the city's subdivision regulations? It doesn't necessarily have to be platted per se, but it does have to meet the standards of the subdivision regs as pertains to utilities.
Because you don't necessarily have to subdivide this property.
Well, see, that's what concerns me.
Why does it concern you?
Well, it concerns me because we're dealing with the possibility down the road where these standards haven't been defined, so to speak. I don't feel comfortable with putting utilities in a haphazard manner.
If we were dealing with a flat piece of property or with some limited constraints, I could see doing a plat and having the typical subdivision guidelines for infrastructure, lighting, landscaping, and sidewalks that we normally do. This is a completely different animal. And I think that we also owe it to the folks that are trying to do this enough flexibility for them to be able to build on that site that is going to be unbelievably difficult to do. And I think when we had our conversation about constraints and that kind of thing, I think this is one of those things that we can probably live without.
I agree. I think if we can give any developer as much latitude for creativity in this, that's going to help make that first development proposal that much sharper. I worry that if we paint the lines too tight, then we're going to get less applications.
Yeah, this is a concept plan.
And the concept is to have Third, Fourth, and Water, and I don't see that
it's on the map.
Well, I think if this framework plan is incorporated into what we're adopting, that's the template that they need to work to.
Yeah.
And if they come in with a proposal that doesn't incorporate that level of connectivity, they're going to have to demonstrate that they have alternatives that give the same level of circulation that this plan would.
Okay, well,
I would submit that anything that comes in that looks significantly different than this framework plan, they're going to have to make a case to the commission why they're deviating from this framework plan.
well, my intent was to get our intent to have third, fourth, and water in the plan. This discussion has done that. So, you know, we don't need to necessarily make it a conditions now, because it's very clear from the record and the discussion that the city wants third, fourth, and water. My next question kind of goes to third, fourth, and water and Main. Is there a requirement that those streets be named that? And I know this gets kind of more to the development, but, you know, one of the nods to the history of the place could be third is Publisher's Place, and the Riverwalk is the Blue Heron River Walk, and, you know, one of them, you know, it's Holly whatever, just kind of, you know, instead of being third, that's kind of, third, but, you know, and maybe Main becomes Mill Street.
What about Smurfit?
Yeah.
Don't they get?
I'm just trying to figure out Smurfit Street, I guess we could put in there.
Don't forget the eels.
But, you know, Lamprey Lane, how's that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think
Okay.
once again, it's diving into detail that we're not ready for. For every person who wants to name Third Avenue, Holly Avenue, I'd probably have someone up here that said, "This is the original plat. These are the street names. We need to keep them." So,
No, I
what I'm
understand.
saying
I
is,
just-
these are these detailed development infrastructure phasing discussions.
Right, I just wanted to make sure that the framework plan with the labels doesn't prohibit other labels from being put in place. Because we definitely have other streets where you're driving down one and you go through an intersection and you're now on another street, so.
Like 39th and Portland.
Well, like Hilda and Holmes and Leland and Lynn. My last question goes to what was 27, so it's page 85.
Yes. We have the revised version. Are you speaking of the new?
Well, yeah, I'm looking at the old 27.
Okay.
Why is ODOT involved in what's happening on a manhole cover inside a private property?
They're involved because we're trying to figure out who owns that manhole and that stormwater line. It's an existing condition.
Okay.
We have an existing condition that goes through the site that's going into the sanitary sewer and needs to be resolved.
Okay.
And this is the best time to put a condition
No,
to resolve
I
it.
got no problem with it. I just
Yeah.
was curious why ODOT was involved in a private
Because
city's...
it may or may not be
Draining
draining
99.
part of 99E.
And that's fine. Okay, thank you. And, let's see, what's this note? 86. Water 4. You have whether the PRV station at Main Street, is that PRV stand for pressure relief valve?
Yeah.
It's an
Reduction.
So pressure reduction relief, okay. Since we don't have it defined, I just wanted to, okay. Now I'm done. I'll stop uproaring things.
You're not done. You just temporarily.
You're just going to take a break.
Yeah.
Take us-
Stir things
We're
up
on,
next
we're
week.
on a break. We're on a
Okay,
break.
so other questions or comments that we want
I just wanted to know if Christina, to try to address Damon's concern, could we put something in here similar to another statement that was made that we strongly encourage with regard to the streets?
I'm actually satisfied by the level of this discussion that the street issue's been
As
resolved.
shown on the framework plan map or
I
something.
guess two things. Strongly encouraged does nothing for us as a regulatory body. The record is what it is. We can come back and look at it. The second thing is, let's just say, what we struggled with was maybe Fourth is a little bit further north than where we show
Sure,
on the
I have no
Maybe
concern
your
about it.
idea of come in with a right turn lane into a parking garage, everybody loves it and it's the best thing, and the community. So, you know, there's two sides to every regulation. And so we believe that we've provided that flexibility, but it always has to come back to this commission to review against all this work that we've done up to this date.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a guiding document. It's kind of like the concept plans we do in Beaver Creek.
Well, that's why I said
Don't-
this
let's not-
discussion
let's say
takes
South
care
End.
of what we need. So.
That was less controversial.
South End, yeah.
Beaver
Okay.
Creek was too controversial.
So, other
Yes,
questions,
I do
comments?
want to go on the record that I would like to see the historic names for the streets be maintained, because it's very easy to tell people you go to the corner of 3rd and whatever, or you go to the corner of 7th and Washington, and people can get that. When you start getting all the crazy names, in deference to my dear, dear, dear friend, somebody can name their building the Holly Building or the Smurfett Building or the Publishers Paper Building or whatever they want to do. I just want it to be, I like the tradition because it's easy. Think of yourself as somebody who's from Mars and you're coming down here and you want to find 4th and Main. You can find it.
Did you argue in Portland when they changed 39th to the...
Oh, heck yes. I was totally not in support of that, and I to this day do not call it by that other name. I still even tell people about being on Union Avenue, and I wasn't even here then. But
And Peninsula.
yes.
Other questions, comments?
I'm just looking at the list of prohibited uses. I was a little concerned about G, which is prohibited motor vehicle and recreational vehicle sales and incidental services.
Are you talking about the design guide, the Willamette Falls
Yeah.
downtown district?
Correct.
Okay, because I thought, okay, we just switched. Okay.
And so I'm just thinking about the testimony of our last meeting where we had the guy that did the paddle boarding. Those are recreational vehicles, I would think. I'm just worried that we're drawing this too tight where if we're getting legitimate like whitewater or recreation right
They're not
there.
motorized.
They're not motorized,
Yeah, but neither's a trailer.
It says motor vehicle and recreational vehicle sales.
I don't really want a car lot or an RV lot down there, to be honest with you. That's what this
Well,
is saying.
but
Actually, we define recreational vehicle as an
I
RV.
don't think Zach does either. It just
No,
he just didn't want to. He didn't want to be exclusive of any other desirable recreational uses.
That's
by
all,
that-
because I mean,
by that
if-
definition.
Didn't want to be able to have a
whether
kayak house
it's
there or
existing
whatever.
now or
Well,
existing.
kayak is not motorized.
It's
So
still a
we do
recreational
define
vehicle.
recreational vehicle as.
I can get that
totally
A
definition.
disagree with
trailer
that.
is not
That's what-
motorized. A fifth wheel is
And
not
this is
motorized,
sharing
and they
a
are
prohibited use
recreational
that we have
vehicles.
currently in our mixed-use downtown.
Okay. Sold them for
And it's in
35 years,
response
so they
to
get a definition.
a desire for the mixed-use downtown to change out of an automobile-centric.
No, that's helpful. That's what I'm trying to do.
Do we have the Blue Heron Tattoo Shop prohibited?
You can get your tattoo down there.
Okay.
Smurfett.
Absolutely.
Smurfing.
There's already
So,
two.
were there any other questions while we
Yeah,
have
so we can move
our
this
staff,
forward.
our
I might
consultant
want to go
teams
through the
here?
matrix, but if we're going to start talking about this, I had some questions. I'm trying to, in my brain, so we're talking about a single store on 1735-020, not to exceed 40,000 square feet. So give me some context. Is that Rite Aid or what is it? I mean,
This is the conditional use break. So we have
Right.
the
But
break
No,
for.
give me
How
some
big
idea.
is a 40,000 square foot building?
I'd say here's an example of the Hagens in Oregon City is about 60,000, give or take.
okay, too big. So I'm just trying to think of something we have that's
Walgreens or Rite Aid
40,000.
might be for 40.
What if it was a new season?
I mean,
I'd say most Trader Joe's are probably more 15 to 20,000, and New Seasons can be anywhere in that kind of
The one in Sylvan is
30 to,
small.
and the biggest one in Happy Valley is a little bit bigger. But
Yeah,
that's kind of what you would, any kind of grocery store you would see in that area is planned to be under that threshold.
Wow.
So I guess under speaking to that size, I think it's our intent that when we look at conditional uses under E, not F, where we talk about something not exceeding 40,000. I know we all said we do not want to see anything that's anywhere smells, looks, sees, or tastes like a big box retail. We don't really want to
And
go
through
there.
the conditional use process, you're allowed to look at projects that may be on the margin, but maybe kicked up to that, but are compatible, but flat out are saying, if you're coming in with something big.
But just real quick, how big are some of those buildings down there? They're cavernous, aren't they?
Right, and they could have multiple uses in
Yes,
there, correct?
I mean, that's what I'm envisioning.
Okay, but again,
So I guess under conditional uses, I would delete A, B, and C. I don't see where we would want a hospital down there, but I could see something like you have under P, where what I would look at is outpatient infirmary services, something like a Zoom care or whatever those places. I'm not saying it's a Zoom care, but a Zoom care-like facility. And then I'm just not sure an assisted living facility. I know it's residential, but I'm just having a little heartburn about that. And
Why would you exclude assisted living from that zone?
I just, even as a conditional use permit, I'm not really seeing it. And that's why I said, why do we have a hospital? I'm not really seeing.
Well, I agree with you about
hospital.
the hospital, but assisted living is essentially a more specialized residential.
I agree. I'm just making
facility.
a comment.
And that might also reduce parking burden as well.
Yeah, but it's all the people coming there. It's not reducing parking.
It's not exactly tourist.
No,
tourism.
but so I just had a question mark under P where we had medical, dental clinics, outpatient, infirmary services, and then under Y. So this is a debate that I've had for close to 20 years. There is a difference between live-work and work-live. If you're talking about a live-work unit, it's a unit that the primary occupancy of that particular unit is to live there, and you incidentally work there. So are you also precluding someone from having a work-live unit where their primary occupancy is working there, and they might have a little loft where they might, for instance, some of those artist studios that they have, the Madrona Court, primarily that is designed for them to have a studio, they work there, and they have an incidental living situation.
I think it was intended to allow both. And so if we need to revise our code, then we'll have to come back with you next week. But that is exactly
in most
allowing
jurisdictions, the live work allows the entire ground floor to be a work retail.
Not necessarily. That's why I said
City of Portland does.
I worked on this with the City of Portland, and we were very specific in the IG1 zone to make the distinction about whether we wanted live work or work live, because it's an occupancy issue, and
So-
I know of which I speak.
So I think there's two answers. One, the code is trying to be very, very flexible in lots of different uses, and it's going to be building code.
Yes, it
that's
is,
going
and
to
that's
come
what I was
down.
gonna say to him is
but I
it's
think the
how
goal
it's
is to
built.
have both,
Okay, then we should say we should have both, because again,
and then let the
live-
building code determine how
the
that
live
plays
work
out.
is built to primarily a residential occupancy, whereas the work live has got to be built to a different
Right,
occupancy. It's more of a
and
commercial
we
occupancy.
will allow multifamily, but I think we have come into a point where we've got to make sure that if you want to live above your commercial use, we need to, that's allowed. We need
Yeah.
to really flat out say we agree that's allowed.
Yeah, and I see that as basically two separate uses. A live-work unit is generally,
Right, and so that's
to be the
building
same.
code. So
Okay.
how do we get our
Yeah, so I'm
our,
just-
our
I'm just
use
saying-
permitted uses as flexible and big as possible?
let's-
If that pro forma works its way
let's
through,
just say what we
allow it.
mean to say.
Is there a font? Are you done?
The only other thing I was going to ask about is that, are there going to be, and I think you answered this, but I'll try to remember because I had a lot of notes, is there design standards that are going to go with this district?
Yes, there are the design guidelines that you have in the applicant's proposal, and then we have modified already those design guidelines.
Okay, so I guess I have to reread that again. That's what I have on that. The other questions I have are dealing with the matrix. But thank you, Zach, for bringing that up.
Other questions or comments?
Just one more. Is there a clause in there, or could there be, where if a use was doubtful, that it could be brought to the planning commission for definition as to whether or not it fits the intent of the zone and is therefore allowable, or it's a conditional use and that is got to be referred, or it's not a allowed use at all? That the planning commission has that authority if there is
Like a similar use question?
Yeah, we'd have to make findings and be very specific. It wouldn't be permitted outright. We'd have to make a whole set of.
that it doesn't meet the standards or the.
That's what this.
We'd have to make it meet the standards.
These are your permitted uses.
Yeah, I know that, but if
He's
there was,
talking about something that's a similar use, so it's similar to
and it wasn't
something.
clearly defined in there, but you know the applicant wanted to have it be included, but staff didn't have the authority to issue the building
It comes
permit,
back here.
then
Well, then it has to be conditional use in that case.
Not
We would probably bring it
necessarily.
before you as
Yeah.
a code interpretation of
Yeah.
whether it's.
Yeah, that's what
So
I'm-
that's existing
Yeah,
currently in
that's-
the
I have no
code.
issue
I don't
with
know
that.
that we need to add it here.
No, I don't either. Isn't already existing in our code.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
We've already got a process where if it's
And then
undefined.
these are prohibited uses.
Okay.
You can't put in there.
I'm glad that you do have prohibited uses, because you want to be perfectly clear that, don't even come here asking us about that. We're
Okay.
asking you.
Any other questions, comments?
Just the matrix, yeah.
Do you want to vote for it, or do
Okay.
you want to believe it?
Are there any questions or comments about the matrix that was prepared from last meeting?
That's your cue, Denise.
Well, I'm going to let somebody else who has questions about the matrix say something. Looks like Charles might have some questions.
Well, I was actually looking at the number 2, and I think that addresses the concerns I had about demolition of any structures that it would need to go through the process of identification, being eligible for historic register, and I think that ties in with what we've talked about with the more detailed historic evaluation, and also with the archaeological investigation. So if that condition of approval number 9 can just encompass all those things that we've talked about with that regard, I think that covers that.
As opposed to that archaeological testing, I think we would be remiss if we didn't include that in there. But I can also see that as being a deal breaker. I mean, we find something down there completely unexpected, and all of a sudden, the shovels stop clanging, and there's a court injunction, and whoever decides, I'm going to carry the flag for this and that, and then the investors say, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here, We didn't count on this. And so we've got to walk softly on that. I still am concerned that we get the historical significance of this community represented in that development, because that was the public's intent. They wanted to see that followed through. That was one of the values. And I want to make sure that we don't drop the ball on that. But, after 25 years and a build-out, you're going to drop the ball along the way somewhere. It's inevitable that mistakes are going to be made. I mean,
I hope.
well,
No,
it's up to the chair
not yet.
whether.
But you can do it. You can do it next time. So, wouldn't condition number 10, your proposed condition number 10 on page 82, cover?
Is this the new?
Old document.
We're not looking at the new one.
We got paper old documents somewhere.
Oh, actually, the revised.
Yeah, there's
Oh, no.
There's the
Nope.
highlight. I've got one.
Oh, no, that one's not printed out.
Okay.
I'm going to go to the. Give me one moment.
While she's grabbing that, I guess I'd say where I'm always coming with this whole thing is I don't want to do with this site what was done to the end of the Oregon Trail. I don't want us to blink and have it turn into a landfill. That then means we completely lost historic opportunities. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen here by any means, but this is a once in 150-year opportunity, and we don't want to have it become, a landfill and say, "Ta-da! This is the end of the Oregon Trail. Dump your trash."
I suspect somebody back then was saying something about it, but it just was the time. There was no.
I think the thing all of us are expressing, one way or the other, is that there is historic value to a lot of the structures on the site. They may not all be economically viable. The concern I think everybody has is that once you've torn the building down, there is no going back.
That's right.
So I think we are all kind of weighing in on the side of let's view demolition with great caution before any buildings get taken down. Let's make sure that that's the right decision, because once it's gone, it's gone. And I know I've looked at historic buildings or photos of Portland, especially along Front Avenue, and there are hundreds of buildings that were torn down in the 50s and 60s that would be just spectacular buildings to have today, but they're gone.
Filled with small businesses.
So now you have pictures and no buildings.
Yeah.
So
Museums.
I don't think it's realistic to say let's save all the buildings, but on the other hand, let's proceed with caution as we demolish those buildings, so that we've come to the conclusion that that building doesn't have any significant historic value, because once it's gone, it's gone.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I keep going back and forth between flexibility and certainty. And as I said before, I think anyone going into this, if they have any illusion about what it is or what it isn't, they're obviously not reading. And I think someone would go into this, I hope, with their eyes open, and if they don't, they're going to get the evil eye and the stink eye from the staff before they even see us. But there's, again, so is that on?
So I'm ready with
former condition number 10.
So I'm ready. So condition number 10.
Yeah, if the applicant is
This
proposing
the-
site cleanup, demolition, blah blah blah, and it disturbs.
This is the archaeological evidence
Yes.
one. That has not proposed any amendments.
No,
to that.
I'm just saying would that meet the intent of what we talked about in the testimony that we've had?
This is the archaeology.
Right.
This is below ground.
Right. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
And so at this time, we're recommending that they put in an inadvertent discovery plan. But what is not in this is the pre-plan. And
the
so
pre-survey.
this is kind of where this balance of flexibility and certainty, once again, kind of going back to what George Kramer said, this is the regulatory minimum. They have to, when SHPO is identified there is high likelihood, there will be monitoring during site disturbance. What I'd like to work on is how do we work with the applicant to be proactive, but how that level of pre-work is really, I think, a collaboration with working with the owner and the legacy partners. But there's no metric about exactly what they're doing ahead of time. And I feel at this land use, we need to put at a minimum, you have to do this. And then let's work together to be proactive ahead of time.
I totally agree with that. I mean, I think that someone who's interested in developing here would be remiss if they went onto the site and started doing stuff without doing a check-in with the city. And I just want to make sure that happens.
So their plan and who they're hiring, the archaeologists, what their plan is, how they coordinate with SHPO, what SHPO's identified, that's required. What is not required, I want to be specific about this, is them doing 30 pre-test pits and based on that data coming back and having information. We would like to get there, but once again, this land use application, we're looking at what at a minimum is absolutely required. And that's what we have here.
Okay.
Right, and I think that when you apply for a SHPO permit, they look at the site and dictate all the parameters that they need for the phase 1 testing, from my dealings with them on archaeology stuff. But I don't know that much about it.
Well, and I do think along the lines of what George was talking about earlier, the developer has the option of redeveloping buildings that are not necessarily designated as historic in a way that they maintain the historic integrity of the shell of the building, and yet what they do within the shell may not qualify for historic designation.
Absolutely.
So that they still have the option
So we're talking about
of doing
below
that.
ground.
So that's
below ground.
and that's exactly the case.
Right. It's below ground, Charles.
So for the above ground comment, there will be buildings that can be adapted or used, but they may not exactly meet the Secretary of Interior standards. They can be, Planning Commission will be very happy with what they have, and they've maybe chosen not.
Sure.
Either it's not eligible in itself, or they've not chosen, but you have the ability to look at that for those. those identified structures.
Well, again, using the comment that you made about once it's gone, it's gone. There's so much we don't know archaeologically about that site that more is better. More information is better, and just think of
Proceed with caution.
proceed with caution. That is exactly what I would say. Like I said, I hoped whoever would be looking at a site would check in before they even start going down there and saying, oh yeah, well, let's just take a little shovel or let's bring a backhoe. Don't even bring any equipment. Because if it's a site that there may be some significance.
Well, and I would need basically a comment, I mean, for any demolition permit, I'm going to need a
not talking about
comment.
demolition, I'm talking about below ground.
Well, any permit that's going to affect below ground work.
Yeah, that
I'm going to be needing a comment from SHPO if there's a high likelihood.
That there might be something.
Yeah, and then they're still going to have an inadvertent discovery plan anyway.
Right. I would like to see that.
So
And that's a condition approval for development.
Okay, that's good.
It's okay with me.
Yes.
As I understand the process, Ben goes out and he finds a buyer, okay?
The property owner does.
Well, he's, okay.
You don't have to use Ben as an example. He's feeling embarrassed already.
He's just a
You
consultant.
don't need to get that specific. Don't get that
This is
specific.
just a comic book rendition.
So let's say you find a buyer.
Okay, I go out and find a buyer, okay. And I come to Tony's office and I say, okay, pre-app this. And we sit down and we go over the concept plan here. And you give me all the specs that I've got to meet. And then I go back to the drawing board and I put everything together. Then I come back to you for review by the planning commission to make sure that we've met all the conditions as set forth in this plan, plus all the other standards that may not be outlined in this plan that the city requires as part of it.
Just general city, yeah.
Before a building permit can be issued. In that process, we, as a planning commission, have approved compliance with this plan that we're adopting in the near future, or the commission is going to adopt. Is that what we're doing? Because this thing right now can't be looked at as a detailed development plan until we get plans to review to say it's in compliance with this document.
Correct.
Or you adopt the development standard.
Yeah.
Yeah, they can't develop anything yet based on this. This is just a framework plan.
And that gives the applicant the certainty that in the adoption of this plan here, it gives him the certainty that he can proceed and represent to the investor that these are the standards that you have to address.
Correct.
Okay?
And before they even bring the plan to the commission, staff is going to react to their proposal and tell them if they're meeting the criteria.
Right. Yeah.
They'll say, gee, we don't think the planning commission's going to really look very favorable at this because blah, 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 blah. Or they'll think it's great.
in evaluating the plan that we've adopted.
That's what I said. It has to go through the city staff sieve.
Right. And then we go out and find an arrowhead.
That's right.
Well, we want to
plan-
leave the
then we have a plan
arrowhead
in
where we
place with
find
State
them.
Historic Preservation Office to address that.
Yeah.
That's what this sets up.
That'll be your job?
That's correct.
Okay.
For the next 25 years.
Yeah.
Tony, I really want you to know that
Yeah,
I
right.
appreciate what you said about working on some additional plans for traffic management. My only reservation is that, and I'm saying this in a broad generalization, is that I don't know how many more signs we can put up about people doing things or not doing things because they just don't pay much attention. We now have a reduced speed limit in Kenema, and you would never know it.
Right.
So I mean, I am all for more education, more signage, but you know, sometimes they just stop seeing it.
Gotta go with the Milwaukee plan.
I have been
I-
advocating the Milwaukee plan.
We keep on, I would say probably 80% of the issues that we review here come down to
Traffic.
compliance issues. It's not that we don't have enough regulations.
It's complying.
Compliance. And, you know, how many other applications have we looked at where we're talking about traffic, speed, parking,
Tree
signage,
removal.
tree removal. And it's not that there are no regulations,
No.
it's the compliance. And so going to your example of getting the ticket going through Milwaukee, you know how they deal with that? They've got a motorcycle cop that
And 2 vans.
patrols that corridor going through town like a hawk.
Yep.
And I would say 90% of the time when I drive through Milwaukee, somebody's getting a ticket.
I just was through there today.
Do it.
And that's what I,
So it's not that
that's
we
what
don't
I
have
want.
enough regulations and
So it's
guidelines.
almost
It's the
9,
compliance.
and
Time to go to Dairy Queen.
So our
do you have questions?
No,
Okay.
we were just
I would
talking about the
entertain
matrix.
The idea that we adjourn and come back next week and try to wrap this up.
I second.
Call question.
I don't know if, do we even have to vote on it?
We don't have to
I
vote.
think
I
we,
don't think so.
everybody just say yes.
We're coming back next Monday.
We're adjourned
6
for,
o'clock?
we are adjourned tonight. We'll come back
Seven.
next Monday.
7?
7.
Okay,
Seven.
everybody got that, 7 o'clock next week, not 6?